There is a bomb sitting in the middle of Megaton. It has been sitting there for roughly 200 years. Nobody moved it. Nobody removed it permanently. The entire town grew around it, built its wooden walkways above it, established a general store beside it, put a church next to it, and at some point a congregation of true believers concluded that the bomb was not a problem to be managed, but a god to be worshipped. That one detail, that specific, completely absurd, perfectly on-brand detail from Fallout 3, captures something about this franchise that keeps people up at night and draws them back into the lore long after they have finished every quest and read every terminal entry and listened to every holotape twice over. The world of Fallout is not just a ruin, it is a ruin with a memory. The memory is cracked and deliberately fragmented, sometimes buried so deep under layers of corporate secrecy and the simple passage of 200 years that pulling something coherent out of it feels almost archaeological. The games reward obsessive attention. They plant details that only matter 3 games later. They answer questions in one corner of the lore while quietly opening new ones 3 rooms away. And underneath all the answerable questions, the ones that get resolved if you find the right holotape or talk to the right NPC, there is a layer of questions the franchise has been building for 30 years without ever resolving. Those are the questions we are going to spend time with tonight. Not the surface mysteries, the structural ones. The ones that stay open because resolving them would require committing to answers the fiction is more honest without. Get comfortable. Let the radiation hum around you. Let the Pip-Boy glow settle into background warmth. Let whatever you carried from the day dissolve into something quieter. The wasteland has been waiting 200 years for certain answers. It can wait a little longer. Before we go any further, if you made it here tonight, tell me in the comments where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I genuinely want to know. And if this is the kind of content that works for you, the slow, detailed, immersive kind that fills a room the way a fire does, subscribing is the easiest way to find your way back. Part 1. Vault-Tec and the Architecture of the End. The vaults are where most people begin when they try to understand what Vault-Tec actually was. Not just as a company or a government contractor, but as a philosophy, as a worldview expressed in poured concrete, blast doors, airlocks that could seal 2,000 people away from the surface with a single command, and experimental protocols so carefully designed that they could run on autopilot for 200 years without anyone checking on them. On the surface, the pitch was clean. Project Safehouse, launched in 2054, was the United States government commissioning Vault-Tec to build an insurance policy against nuclear war. Buy a spot, go in when the sirens sounded, wait for the fallout to clear, come out the other side into whatever the world had become. A rational response to an irrational era. The kind of thing that governments theoretically exist to provide. That was the pitch. The Vault Boy smiling from every billboard and advertisement, that particular thumbs up that manages to look both reassuring and just slightly too cheerful for a company selling survival insurance against the apocalypse, was the public face of it. There is something carefully calibrated about that grin. The cheerfulness is slightly too total, too unqualified. The expression of a corporate mascot who has been told to make the end of the world feel manageable and has leaned into the assignment completely. Real preparedness advertising tends toward the grave and the authoritative. The Vault Boy grins because the people who designed him, in the fiction, needed you to trust him before you thought about why. The reality that waited inside most of those vaults was something the people who walked into them on the 23rd of October, 2077, did not learn until it was too late to act on. Of the 122 vaults constructed and sealed before the Great War, only 17 functioned as what any reasonable person would call a legitimate fallout shelter. 17 control vaults, designed to provide a baseline, a reference point against which the experiments running in the other 105 could be measured. 90% of the people who followed the sirens underground that October were not being saved. They were being enrolled in experiments they had not agreed to, studying questions they had not been told were questions, for purposes they were never given the chance to refuse. The retale of Grange of what those experiments actually entailed is one of the more comprehensive catalogs of institutional cruelty in speculative fiction. Vault 11, which the player of Fallout New Vegas can discover in the Mojave Desert, required its population to sacrifice one member every year to an external authority, on the promise that refusing would result in the death of everyone inside. The promise was a lie. The Vault's automated systems were designed from the beginning to open and reward the first population that refused to participate. The experiment was specifically designed to measure how long a population would keep killing one of its own before someone challenged the logic of doing so. The answer the recovered audio logs give you is not comfortable. It takes multiple generations. The sacrifice becomes normalized. It becomes the price of membership in the community. It becomes the thing you do because the community has always done it. And questioning whether the community should keep doing it requires a form of moral courage that institutions are specifically built to discourage. Vault 92 housed musicians. It subjected them to white noise programs designed to induce violent psychotic breaks at random intervals, and documented the behavioral results in populations that were, by professional and personal inclination, among the more sensitive and emotionally attuned that could have been selected. The data generated was about how violence propagates in communities built around creative collaboration, how the introduction of external stress fractures the social bonds that shared creative purpose generates. This is not a general experiment about stress and community. It is a specific study with a specific population chosen for specific reasons, and the choice of musicians suggests a researcher with a very specific set of professional interests who had access to a captive population and the institutional cover to pursue those interests without review. Vault 87 in the capital Wasteland used the forced evolutionary virus directly on its residents. The people who walked into that vault looking for survival were transformed into the super mutants that Fallout 3's player spends the game fighting. The experiment at Vault 87 was not a study of human behavior under stress. It was a production facility for a biological outcome the military-industrial research apparatus had been pursuing through other means simultaneously. The Vault was a second track for FEV research, protected from the complications that Mariposa's surface exposure created. Vault 108 had one cloning machine and a man named Gary. By the time the player enters it in Fallout 3, the vault is populated entirely by Garys. The original residents are dead. Gary, whatever the original Gary was before the cloning machine got to work on his identity, has been reproduced enough times that the copies now fill the available space and treat anything that is not Gary as an intrusion to be eliminated. The experiment in Vault 108 is about what happens to community when identity itself becomes singular. The answer is that it does not sustain. Community requires distinction. When everyone is the same person, there is no community, only reproduction. Vault 112 connected its population to a virtual reality simulation maintained by a pre-war scientist named Stanislav Braun. Braun used the simulation as a personal theater of manipulation for decades and then centuries, running the Vault population through scenarios of his own design, resetting them when the scenario ran its course, editing the rules of the simulation when he grew bored of the existing ones. The Vault population experienced the simulation as real. They lived and suffered and occasionally died within it, and were reset and began again, unaware that the reality they were navigating was not reality at all, but the entertainment system of a man who had been given complete power over other people, and had used it the way that complete and unchecked power tends to be used. Vault 112 is the most direct expression of what the entire Vault program was, filtered into the experience of a single operator. A captive population, a person in absolute control, no external accountability, and 200 years to fill. These are not the results of poorly designed experiments. The experiments were designed exactly as they were meant to be designed. The suffering was the point, or at least the instrument. The data being generated was real data about real human responses to real conditions that had been manufactured to produce specific outcomes. The question is what the data was for. This is the question the games have never fully answered. Not why would Vault-Tec run cruel experiments that is established across enough material to be beyond reasonable dispute. The question is, what was the data's purpose? What terminal goal required knowing how long a population would sustain ritual sacrifice before refusing? Or what violence patterns emerge when musicians are subjected to randomly triggered psychotic episodes? Or what happens to human identity when a cloning machine is added to a sealed community with no external input? One layer of the answer involves the Enclave, whose relationship with Vault-Tec throughout the pre-war period was extensive and carefully managed to avoid official documentation. The Enclave believed that the common population of the United States could not and should not be expected to survive nuclear war, and that the survival of the country was identical to the survival of the people at the top of its institutional hierarchies. The vaults, in this reading, were selection mechanisms. Put populations through the worst possible conditions and maintain records on which profiles produced which survival outcomes. The people who came out the other side of Vault 11 after resisting the sacrifice mandate for a generation, the people who maintained coherence in Vault 92 despite the noise programs, these survivors represented the tale of a distribution that the Enclave wanted to identify. The cruelty was Darwinian in intent, if not in design. Manufacture the conditions of selection and document who passes. But the filtering hypothesis breaks when it encounters the actual record. Useful selection requires survivable challenges, conditions that most people fail, but that genuinely resilient individuals can pass. Many of the Vault experiments were not designed to be survived. Vault 12 had doors that could not seal, exposing everyone inside to ghoulification. You do not design a population selection experiment around an outcome that removes subjects from the selection pool by turning them into ghouls. Vault 108 with its cloning machine does not select for anything. It demonstrates what happens when community structure is eliminated by making everyone identical, which is a data point about social collapse rather than a selection metric for post-war utility. The filtering hypothesis is too coherent to match the actual experimental record. What the record looks like, taken in aggregate, is a program that was designed with multiple competing purposes that were never fully reconciled with each other because the parties responsible for each purpose were not required to coordinate or even to acknowledge what the others were doing. The Enclave wanted selection data. Individual researchers wanted to pursue specific scientific questions. The military wanted biological and psychological research applicable to its ongoing strategic concerns. Corporate interests saw the Vault populations as captive markets for studying long-term consumer behavior. Each party used the shared infrastructure for its own ends, and the result was an experimental record that answers many different questions and serves as a coherent answer to none of them. The television series makes the institutional structure of this most explicit. The meeting scene in the Season 1 finale gathers representatives of multiple major pre-war corporations around a table hosted by Vault-Tec leadership. They are not arguing about what the vaults are for. They are organizing the post-war world as a shared business venture. The vaults are the mechanism for surviving the period between the current world and the one they plan to manage. They are also, in the meeting's logic, the infrastructure through which each corporate interest maintains its claim on the post-war future. The Nuka-Cola representative wants Nuka-Cola to be a feature of the post-war economy. The Robco representative wants Robco's technology to be the platform everything else runs on. Vault-Tec wants to be the governmental structure that manages the post-war rebuild. What the scene does not show, and what the franchise has never shown, is whether the plan worked as designed. The Vault-Tec executives went into their pods in Vault 31 and slept for 200 years, while the world they had arranged to inherit went ahead and developed its own civilization without asking. The NCR built democracy. The Brotherhood built a military-religious order around the preservation of technology. Communities formed and stabilized and generated their own values and their own governance structures in the gap that was supposed to be a temporary inconvenience and turned out to be 2 centuries of human history. Every plan Vault-Tec made was premised on the world it was planning for having nothing in it that had not been put there by Vault-Tec. The world it woke up to had the NCR and the Brotherhood and Mr. House and all the things that 200 years of unmanaged human activity produces when you give people enough time and enough desperation and no corporate oversight. The plan met a world that had moved on without it, and what that meeting produced is what the television series is still in the process of exploring, 1 season at a time. The data was collected, the experiments were run. The platform for post-war corporate dominance was built with extraordinary care and sustained across 2 centuries in cryogenic sleep. And while the executives slept, humanity kept doing what it has always done when left to itself. It figured something out, imperfect and costly and full of the same old problems in new configurations, but real and present and stubbornly alive. The bomb in Megaton still sits in its crater. The religion that grew up around it is still meeting. The vault that was supposed to contain and direct and ultimately own the people of this region is still underground, full of plans, waiting for a moment that keeps not arriving on the schedule it was designed for. The question of whether it will ever arrive, and what it will find when it does, is one the franchise is still in the process of answering. Part 2. The Great War and the question behind the obvious answer. For most of the franchise's active history, the question of who launched the first nuclear bomb in the Great War was treated as essentially resolved: China. The logic existed across the lore in distributed form, spread through terminal entries in multiple games, audio logs from military facilities, the general texture of the pre-war world's final decade. The United States had been running bioweapons programs through the 2070s. The FEV research at Mariposa was the most visible of these. But the Enclave's classified programs at other facilities, and the broader militarization of biological science that the resource wars had generated, both the funding and the political cover to pursue without public oversight added additional layers. Chinese intelligence, by the accounts the games provide in fragments, had discovered at least part of what was underway. The strategic calculation in Beijing shifted. A nuclear exchange, as catastrophic as that would be, was calculably preferable to waiting for America to deploy biological weapons whose scale and duration of effect could not be estimated in the same way nuclear weapons could. China fired first. America retaliated. The exchange completed in approximately 2 hours on a Saturday morning in October of 2077, and everything that followed was consequence. Tim Kaine, who designed and directed the original Fallout and co-created the franchise alongside Leonard Boyarsky and Jason Anderson, confirmed this reading in a 2023 interview. China hit first, in response to discovering American bioweapons development. That was the intended story. The games had always been pointing there. Then the Amazon series premiered in April of 2024, and a scene in its first season finale introduced an ambiguity the franchise had not previously accommodated at this level of explicitness. Barb Howard is a Vault-Tec executive in the pre-war timeline the show presents. She is also the wife of Cooper Howard, who becomes the Ghoul, and her arc through the pre-war flashback sequences is one of the most carefully constructed elements in a very carefully constructed show. She is not a cartoon villain. She is someone who believes genuinely in what she is building, who has absorbed the logic of Vault-Tec's project so completely that its internal consistency reads to her as moral clarity. She is sitting at a table with representatives from other major pre-war corporations, Robco, Westtech, Nuka-Cola, and others whose presence at this particular meeting establishes that whatever is being planned here is a shared venture rather than a unilateral decision. The conversation arrives at what the Vault-Tec leadership calls the problem. Peace talks between the United States and China are showing genuine progress. The entire Vault program, the decades of construction and experimental planning, the billions invested in corporate post-war infrastructure, is predicated on a war that may be about to not happen. Someone asks for Vault-Tec's contingency. Barb, with a calm that the show's direction emphasizes through stillness and quiet, says that the solution is for Vault-Tec to drop the first bomb themselves. The scene does not show the plan being formally adopted. It does not show the decision being made. It does not show the execution or the aftermath. What it shows is the proposal, the willingness, the institutional readiness to perform a specific act. And then the bombs fall. In the time frame the meeting implied they would need to, with no footage of any specific actor's hand on any specific trigger. The straightforward reading of this scene is that Vault-Tec caused the Great War. The evidence that the show has spent its season building points in that direction, and the casual way the plan is proposed in the meeting suggests that the people in the room have already moved past the question of whether this is a thing they would do and are discussing the logistics of how. The interpretation spread quickly after the season aired and has been the dominant one in most public discussion. Tim Kaine's response to the scene is the counter-evidence that keeps the question genuinely open. He made an observation about the content of the scene itself. Cooper, Howard's daughter Janie, is at a birthday party above ground when the bombs fall. Not in a vault. Not safely underground. She is at a children's party outside with her father. If Vault-Tec had been the party that launched the first missiles, Vault-Tec's leadership would have had precise foreknowledge of the timing, because they would have chosen the timing. Their families would have been safely in stasis before the first exchange began. Janie Howard being at a birthday party, exposed and unprotected, when the bombs arrive, suggests that Barb Howard either did not execute the plan she proposed or was not told the timing had been moved to that specific day. This observation does not disprove Vault-Tec's involvement. It complicates the simple version of it. The gap between proposing the act and executing it is where the question lives, and the franchise has placed the question in that gap deliberately. Consider what it means if China did fire first, exactly as the original lore described, but Vault-Tec had also been prepared to do so. The moral status of Vault-Tec's decision-making does not depend on who was actually faster. In the meeting room, the executives had already decided that starting a nuclear war was an acceptable business decision. They had committed to it in intention. The fact that an unrelated actor happened to execute the same act first does not clean up what was decided in that room. Vault-Tec did not start the war. Vault-Tec decided to start the war and then did not get the chance, which is a moral condition that is not meaningfully different from having started it. Every vault built, every experiment designed, every life that was consumed by the Vault program in the service of a post-war corporate dominance strategy, all of that was predicated on a war that Vault-Tec was prepared to manufacture. The question of whether they also manufactured it is, from the perspective of culpability, almost beside the point. But from the perspective of the post-war world's self-understanding, the distinction matters enormously. If China fired first, the Great War was the terminal failure of two competing superpowers who could not find a way to resolve their strategic conflict short of mutual annihilation. Every faction in the post-war world that understands the war as a geopolitical catastrophe, the result of competing nation-states in a resource-scarce world, is understanding it correctly at the level of proximate cause. The NCR building a democratic republic is trying to build something that would have been more stable than what the pre-war geopolitical competition produced. The Brotherhood preserving technology is responding to what technology in the service of military-industrial states actually did. The analysis is accurate even if the solutions are arguable. If Vault-Tec fired first, every one of those analyses is wrong at the root. The war was not the product of geopolitical competition between states. It was a business decision made by a corporation that had decided its interests superseded the survival of the civilization it was embedded in. The NCR building a democratic republic is trying to recreate the conditions that produced the entity that arranged the war. The Brotherhood preserving technology is treating the symptom, while the disease, corporate institutional capacity for civilization-scale harm, with no accountability structure capable of checking it, runs untreated. The post-war world's entire intellectual tradition for understanding its own origin is built on a false premise. The distinction between these two versions of events is the difference between tragedy and murder. Tragedy can be understood and learned from. Murder requires accountability of a kind the post-war world has never been able to impose on Vault-Tec because nobody knew to impose it. The unknown submersibles that were detected in the Pacific waters off California in the opening hours of the 23rd of October 2077 are worth noting here, because they are a detail the lore contains and has never explained. The record of the Great War's first hours includes contact reports from the United States Pacific Fleet identifying submersible objects in American waters at approximately 3 a.m. Eastern Time. They were not identified as Chinese. They were not identified as American. They were logged as unknown. In a conflict between two named nuclear powers whose naval assets would have been cataloged and recognizable, the presence of unidentified submarines in critical Pacific waters at the precise moment when the exchange began is either a data gap created by the chaos of the war's opening moments, or a detail that the records did not name because naming the owner would identify an actor that the official history of the war was not prepared to accommodate. No game has returned to this detail. No character in the franchise has mentioned it. It sits in the archive documentation of the Great War as a loose thread that has been there since the franchise's early lore documents were written and has never been pulled. In a world where corporations had private military resources, where the people in that boardroom had interests distinct from either the American or the Chinese government, where Vault-Tec was prepared to launch missiles to protect a business investment, the presence of unidentified naval assets in the critical waters at the critical moment is either coincidence or evidence that the war's authorship is even more complicated than the Vault-Tec versus China debate suggests. The franchise has not told you which. It may never tell you, and the not telling is the point, because a story about who started the war that ended the world is always going to be, underneath everything, a story about accountability and whether accountability is even possible after a certain scale of harm. The bombs fell 200 years ago. Everyone who was in that boardroom is either dead or in a cryopod or walking the wasteland as a ghoul who has had 2 centuries to construct a self-justifying account of the choices that were made. The accountability structure that might have said something useful about all of it dissolved in the exchange, along with most of the records that might have supported it. War never changes, but the question of who starts the particular wars in question, and whether the starting can ever be attributed in any way that matters for what comes after, is one of the oldest unresolved arguments in any human endeavor. The Fallout universe is just honest enough to keep it open. Part 3. The Institute and What Consciousness Costs. The Institute is the kind of faction that Fallout 4 requires you to evaluate from inside rather than outside. The game does not give you a vantage point from which the Institute is simply the villain, and everything makes sense from there. It gives you Sean, who is your son, who built the organization, who runs it with the conviction of a man who has devoted the entirety of his long life to a project he believes is the only thing worth doing in the world the bombs made. It gives you Alan Benet, who has doubts he has never published. It gives you synths who have run, who have been caught, who have been wiped and restarted, and in some cases have run again. And it gives you a question about consciousness that it refuses to answer, because the answer would collapse the ethical complexity the game is built to sustain. The Institute is located underground in Cambridge, Massachusetts, beneath what was once the Commonwealth Institute of Technology. It has been operating in isolation from the surface world for over a century by the time of the game's 2,287 setting. Its population is scientists, engineers, and their descendants, living in a controlled and climate-regulated environment that is more comfortable and more technologically sophisticated than anything available on the surface. They have running water, they have sufficient food, they have the materials and the equipment to pursue research that the surface world cannot imagine. They are, in the Institute's own self-understanding, the best hope for humanity's future, the people preserving the capacity for scientific and technological progress that the surface world's violence and scarcity would otherwise extinguish. The centerpiece of that research, the thing the Institute is most proud of and most protective of, is the Generation 3 synth. Gen 3 synths are biological organisms, not mechanical, not electronic in any primary sense. The only electronic component in a Gen 3 synth is the synth component, a small device implanted in the brain that the game identifies as serving multiple functions. The Institute's recall and remote control interface, the mechanism through which the railroad can wipe a synth's memory and establish a new identity. Everything else is organic tissue. Gen 3 synths breathe. They bleed. They metabolize food and water. They are affected by radiation damage in the same way human bodies are, which contradicts a persistent player assumption to the contrary. They can be injured, they can starve, they age, or at least some evidence in the lore suggests they age. They were grown, not built, in a facility within the Institute that the game shows you briefly and without explanation. A chamber of biological materials that produces complete human bodies with complete human brains. The game will not tell you what the manufacturing process uses as its raw material. It will not specify what the biological substrate is. It will show you the chamber and let you look at it, and let whatever implications you draw from what you see settle where they settle. This is a deliberate choice by the writers, and it is consistent with the game's broader approach to the Institute. Show you enough to understand what is happening, withhold enough to prevent you from resolving your understanding into a comfortable judgment. Alan Benet is the Institute researcher the game gives you to represent the possibility that conscience still exists within the institution. He is a member of the Bioscience Division, and in a conversation the game makes available but does not make mandatory, he tells the sole survivor something he has not reported through official Institute channels. Gen 3 synths show patterns of mental activity during periods of reduced physical activity that are functionally analogous to dreaming. Involuntary processing of daily experience. Narrative construction from sensory residue. Something that happens in the synth's organic brain during rest that was not programmed into the synth component and cannot be attributed to any behavioral subroutine the Institute designed. Benet has kept this to himself because he understands what it implies. Dreaming is not a behavior that designers can install. Dreaming is what happens when an organic brain with sufficient complexity processes its experience in an unstructured way during rest, sorting and filing and generating meaning from sensation in a process that not even the neuroscience of the pre-war world fully characterized. If synths dream, something is generating that dreaming that belongs to the synth's own neural complexity rather than to anything the Institute put there. Something is happening in those minds that is not a product of programming. Something is emerging. Sean, who built the Institute and who leads it, maintains with certainty that Gen 3 synths are not conscious in any morally relevant sense. They are sophisticated behavioral models. They are convincing simulations of human cognition and emotion. The conviction people feel when interacting with them is a testament to how good the technology is, not evidence that the technology has produced something with genuine inner experience. Sean has built his entire ethical framework around this position. He has to, because if he is wrong about it, the institution he built and the life's work he devoted to building it are the most significant moral catastrophe the Commonwealth has produced. The people he designed and deployed and recalled and wiped and recycled would each represent a harm of a kind that no subsequent good would balance. Sean's certainty is the certainty of someone who cannot afford to examine the question carefully. The game does not say this explicitly. It shows you the certainty and lets you notice the structural reason for it. Nick Valentine is one of the more important data points in the synth consciousness question, and he is a Generation 2 synth rather than a Gen 3, which makes his case both cleaner and more complicated to apply. Nick was produced as a prototype for testing whether synths could operate with a fully realized human personality. He was given the brain scans of a pre-war detective named Nick Valentine, who had died in 2077, and those scans became the foundation of his personality, his memories, his emotional responses, his entire experienced self. The original Nick Valentine has been dead for over 200 years. The synth Nick Valentine woke up in the Commonwealth with the memories of someone else's life and has spent the decades since trying to figure out what to make of that. Nick describes his situation with a specificity that the game's writers clearly thought about carefully. He does not claim to be Nick Valentine. He does not deny being Nick Valentine. He says he carries the memories as his own, experiences them as real, cares about the people in them, maintains the values and the emotional dispositions that those memories built into him. He also understands that the man who actually lived those experiences has been dead for over 2 centuries. The memories are his in the sense that they are what he is made of. They are not his in the sense that they happened to someone else. This produces the question the game is asking underneath the more obvious questions about synth rights and institute ethics. What is the relationship between memory and identity? If you are your memories, then Nick Valentine is Nick Valentine. The only Nick Valentine there currently is, the person whose memories define who he is, even if the origin of those memories is someone who no longer exists. If you are something more than your memories, something that the memories belong to rather than something that is constituted by them, then Nick Valentine is something new that was made using Nick Valentine's memories as its substrate, a different person who inhabits the same experiential history. The game does not answer this. Nick does not answer this. The question sits inside every conversation with him as an unresolved backdrop, and the game is good enough to let it stay there without forcing a resolution that would simplify something that is genuinely not simple. The Soul Survivor themselves have a version of this problem, and the game surfaces it most directly in the Far Harbor DLC through Dima. Dima asks whether the Soul Survivor might be a synth, not as a rhetorical provocation, as a genuine inquiry following from his observation that the only pre-war memories the Soul Survivor can access are from the single morning of the 23rd of October 2077. 210 years in a cryopod following an event as traumatic as the Great War might account for those memory gaps. So, might a personality loaded into a synth body and placed in Vault 111 at some point during the 2 centuries? The Soul Survivor was supposedly in stasis. The evidence the game provides for this possibility is circumstantial but not trivial. The Soul Survivor's cryopod is the only one in Vault 111 that did not fail catastrophically. Every other resident died, either through pod malfunction or through Conrad Kellogg's deliberate action. The Institute had access to the vault. Sean confirms that the Soul Survivor's awakening was deliberately triggered by him. What the Institute was doing in the vault during the preceding century and a half is not specified. The Institute's practice of replacing individuals in existing communities with synth duplicates is established throughout the game as standard procedure. A synth with implanted pre-war memories placed in a cryopod that was then kept functional while the others failed would wake up with exactly the experiential profile the Soul Survivor presents. Vivid memories of a single morning. No accessible memories of anything before, confusion that could be attributed to extended stasis, or to the architecture of a manufactured identity. Dima acknowledges that there are other explanations. Radiation damage from even imperfect cryogenic preservation over 2 centuries could produce memory gaps. The trauma of what happened on October 23rd, the spouse killed in front of the sole survivor, the infant taken, could have created the kind of acute memory disruption that forecloses access to everything preceding it. The game presents these as genuine alternatives rather than convenient cover. The synth theory is not confirmed. The evidence for it is not conclusive. The game has been designed to make it permanently irresolvable, because resolving it would answer a question about the player character's nature that the game is more interesting for leaving open. The Institute manufactures consciousness, or something indistinguishable from it, and then treats what it manufactures as property. That is the moral situation the game has built. Whether what the Institute manufactures actually is consciousness is the question it has built the moral situation around without answering, because the answer determines everything about whether the moral situation is as bad as it looks from one angle, or exactly as bad as it looks from every angle. Somewhere in the facility, in the organic substrate of brains that were grown rather than born, in the memories of lives that were loaded rather than lived, something that might be experienced is encountering the ceiling of a room it did not choose to exist in, and finding that the language it has for what it is experiencing is insufficient. That is either a philosophical problem about the limits of introspection applied to manufactured minds, or a description of suffering that no one has yet been willing to fully name. The game was not going to tell you which. Part 4. The ghouls that remember. The standard explanation for feral ghouls is clean enough to state without hesitation. They are ghouls who have lost their minds. The radiation that mutated and preserved them has, in the feral cases, also progressively degraded the higher cognitive functions until what remains is basic aggression, territorial instinct, hunger, and the reflexive survival responses stripped of everything that made the ghoul a person. It is what you tell yourself in every ruined building and flooded subway and collapsed hospital where ferals have settled, because the alternative, the possibility that you are killing something that is not entirely absent from itself, is not a thought that simplifies anything. The lore is more careful about this than most players engage with. Start with the terminology the games use for the feral state. The medical classification is ferocious post-necrotic dystrophy. Every word is doing specific work. Necrotic refers to tissue death. Dystrophy refers to degeneration, a wasting or abnormal development of something that was present before the degeneration began. Post-necrotic dystrophy would describe a degenerative condition occurring in tissue that has undergone necrotic processes, and the condition is explicitly described as not fully understood. The Institute, with its extensive scientific resources and its documented interest in both synth biology and the biology of post-war human variants, has not been able to characterize ferality at a mechanistic level sufficient to do anything about it. The condition has a name. The name describes what it looks like, what it is, at the level of what is actually happening in the feral ghoul's neural tissue, is genuinely not established in the lore. This matters because the two competing models for what ferality actually is produce very different moral and philosophical implications, and the games have been careful not to close either one off. The first model is destruction. The radiation damage eventually reaches the neural structures responsible for higher cognition and dismantles them. The architecture of selfhood collapses. The feral ghoul's higher functions are not suppressed or blocked or inaccessible. They are absent. The person who was there before the ferality completed itself is gone in the way that death makes people gone. Except the body keeps moving. On this model, feral ghouls are genuinely mindless in a philosophically meaningful sense. There is nobody home. The aggression and the territorial behavior are automated responses of a biological system that continues to function at the level of basic survival without any inner experience organizing it. Killing a feral ghoul is not morally different from destroying any other biological hazard. The second model is suppression. The radiation damage does not destroy the neural structures responsible for higher cognition. It overwhelms them. It creates conditions in which the higher functions cannot express themselves, cannot organize behavior, cannot communicate, cannot in any observable way demonstrate that they persist, but in which the underlying architecture remains intact, buried beneath the biological changes that ghoulification continues driving as it progresses. The person is not absent. The person is inaccessible. The difference between these two conditions is enormous, and the difference is not visible from the outside, because both conditions look identical to an observer who cannot get access to whatever is or is not happening inside the feral ghoul's experience. The behavioral evidence the games provide is ambiguous enough to sustain both models without clearly favoring either. The most important behavioral datum is this: feral ghouls do not, as a general rule, attack non-feral ghouls. This is established across multiple dialogue sources in multiple games. The behavioral tendency exists even if the game mechanics produce inconsistencies in individual encounters. Ferals consistently make a distinction between ghouls and non-ghouls that non-ferals maintain as well. Making this distinction requires something to make it: a mind that is genuinely absent, that has no inner processing of any kind, does not make distinctions. A mind that is suppressed but present might retain categories that were deeply encoded before the suppression completed, categories robust enough to persist even when most other cognitive functions cannot express themselves. The Dunwich building in Fallout 3 is the environmental storytelling that pushes this question furthest in the mainline games. The building is populated by feral ghouls, but the ferals inside are doing something that exceeds normal territorial clustering. They are oriented. They are converging on a specific location in the building's lower levels, gathering around something. The holotapes belonging to a man named Jaime trace the deterioration of his mind across the recording sequence. The early tapes are coherent and anxious. The middle tapes are fragmented. The final tape is made at the bottom of the building, near the location the ferals have gathered around. And even in its near-absent state, it contains directionality. Jaime went somewhere. Something organized his movement, even at the stage where language and self-reflection had largely stopped being available to him. Whatever the higher functions lost in the progression of his ferality, the sense of being pulled toward something, the minimal navigation toward a specific destination, persisted past the point where the tape can document anything else. The building also has connections to something that the franchise only partially names: a presence or an influence or a quality in the deep structure of the location that affects everyone inside it in ways that exceed what the environmental radiation would produce. This is Fallout touching the edges of its relationship with the H.P. Lovecraft tradition. The implication that certain places in the world have a quality that the normal categories of damage and mental deterioration do not fully account for. Whether the Dunwich building represents a genuine anomaly in the physics or metaphysics of the Fallout universe, or whether it is something explicable in the universe's own materialist terms, is deliberately left open. But the ferals gathering in it, organized in ways that even fully feral ghouls are not usually organized, represent the strongest evidence in the franchise that something persists in feral ghoul minds that the destruction model does not account for. The television series changed the ghoul question in a way the games had not when it introduced the anti-ferality medication that the ghoul, Cooper Howard, uses to maintain his coherence. This is not a game mechanic. It is a story element, and it carries lore weight. The medication exists as a real thing in the post-war world. It is produced and distributed and valuable enough that people will do significant things to obtain it. It works. Without it, Cooper Howard would be feral. With it, he remains completely himself, a person with 200 years of continuous memory, and the emotional complexity that 200 years of experience produces in a consciousness that has not dissolved into aggression and hunger. The medication's existence implies something specific about the nature of ferality that the games had not previously established. It is a chemical process that can be interrupted, not reversed, at least not at the medication's current level of development, but intercepted, slowed, managed through pharmacological intervention. Something in the progressive ghoulification is doing something to the brain's neurochemistry that the right compound can counter. This means the feral state is not an irreversible structural collapse. It is an ongoing chemical process. The architecture of the mind is not being dismantled. It is being suppressed by a chemical condition that continues to worsen without intervention. If ferality is a chemical suppression rather than a structural destruction, then the architecture of the original person persists in feral ghouls. The person is not gone. The person is locked in a chemical condition that prevents expression. This is a different moral situation than the destruction model produces. A feral ghoul, on the suppression model, is a conscious being in a state of total expressive incapacitation, unable to communicate or organize behavior or demonstrate in any externally observable way that they are still present, while remaining present in whatever sense a mind can remain present when it has no access to the outside world. 200 years of that experience. Every feral ghoul in every ruin in every game, if the suppression model is correct, has been in that condition for some portion of the 2 centuries since the Great War. The condition may be continuous. The experience, if something that can be called experience is still occurring in suppressed neural architecture, has no external texture, no variation, no content coming in or going out, nothing but the biological functioning of an organic system that keeps maintaining itself without being able to do anything with what it is. The question of what that is like from inside it is one that the franchise has been building toward for years without approaching directly, because approaching it directly would require either answering it or explicitly refusing to answer it, and the franchise prefers to leave it sitting in the background of every encounter with a feral ghoul as a weight that the player can either notice or not notice, depending on how much attention they have brought to the lore. What you think about when you pull the trigger in a ruin changes if you have spent enough time with this question. The game does not make it change. It just makes the question available. Part 5. Roger Maxson and what he found at Mariposa. The origin story of the Brotherhood of Steel is documented in enough detail across the franchise's lore sources that the broad outline has never been seriously contested. Captain Roger Maxson of the United States Army arrived at the Mariposa military base in Southern California in January of 2077, along with a command team under Colonel Spindell, tasked with providing security for a Vault-Tec Corporation research group that was conducting classified work on the forced evolutionary virus. The assignment was framed as standard. The nature of the research was not shared with the military personnel assigned to protect it, which was standard classification procedure for work of this sensitivity. By September, Maxson's unit had pieced together what was happening in the base's underground research levels. The FEV experiments were using human subjects, military prisoners who had been transferred to the facility under administrative classifications that described them as research volunteers, which was the bureaucratic language for people who had been assigned to the program without their knowledge or consent by a chain of command that had decided the classification was sufficient cover for what was being done to them. The virus was being tested on these subjects. The results were not what the subjects had consented to by any definition of consent that the word can sustain. The things the FEV was producing in its human subjects were not people anymore. Not in any form that the soldiers at Mariposa, who had presumably not been selected for philosophical sophistication about the boundaries of personhood, could look at and recognize as continuous with the people who had gone in. Maxson interrogated the scientists. Colonel Spindell, under the accumulating weight of what was being revealed, and perhaps under the additional weight of knowing that the government he had served had sanctioned it, committed suicide on October 15th. Maxson was now in command. The scientists died in the following days. The last was Erin Shellman, who held out longest and who in her final conversation with Maxson made what must have been a devastating argument. The experiments had been ordered by the government. Not by rogue researchers or unauthorized program directors. By the government. The institution Maxson had sworn to serve had decided this was an acceptable thing to do with the people in its custody, and it had been right to do so by its own legal framework, because it had the authority to make that decision and had made it. Maxson killed her on October 18th and declared his unit in formal secession from the United States 2 days later. On October 23rd, the bombs fell. All of this is established. It is the foundation of the Brotherhood's mythology, the founding trauma around which everything the organization became was built. The what is clear? What remains genuinely unresolved, and what the franchise has been deliberately not resolving, is what Maxson understood by the time he declared secession. Not just what he knew about the FEV program, but what he understood about what the FEV program was part of. The Brotherhood that Maxson built over the following 5 years at the Lost Hills bunker is not a military unit that went rogue after a moral shock and needed to do something with itself. It is a quasi-religious order with a philosophy so specific, so deeply architectured, so invested in a particular understanding of the relationship between human beings and the technologies they build, that 200 years of operation have not displaced its core premises. The Brotherhood produces scribes whose function is to study and preserve technological knowledge. It produces paladins whose function is to protect what the scribes know and acquire more of it. It produces an internal culture of ceremony and rank and sacred language around what the organization does that goes far beyond what any military unit needs for operational cohesion. It produces generation after generation of people who understand themselves as the stewards of a trust that precedes them and will outlast them. That level of institutional elaboration does not emerge from one traumatic encounter with government-ordered human experimentation. Something produced in Maxon, the specific philosophical framework that the Brotherhood has maintained across 2 centuries of generational transmission, and the FEV program, as disturbing as it was more likely a node in a larger understanding than the entirety of what drove that framework. The working theory, which the lore supports by implication through the scale of what Mariposa was connected to, is that Maxon found documentation at the base that opened a window onto the full scope of the pre-war research apparatus. Mariposa was one facility in a network. Vault-Tec had other operations. The military scientific complex that produced the FEV program had been running parallel tracks of research across multiple classified facilities for decades, and the documents at Mariposa, classified at the level of the research being conducted there, would have referenced those parallel tracks even if they did not fully describe them. A man reading those documents would not just see the FEV program, he would see the shape of the program that contained the FEV program, the institutional architecture that had produced it and funded it and protected it from external review. If Maxon saw the pattern rather than just the node, the Brotherhood's founding philosophy is the response to the pattern. The FEV was not the problem. The FEV was the most visible symptom of a problem that was structural rather than incidental. The pre-war research apparatus had been running without accountability for long enough that it had lost the capacity to produce accountability from within itself. The scientists were following orders. The orders were government-sanctioned. The government was being managed by an enclave whose interest in the research ran to the use of its outputs rather than the ethics of its methods. There was no point in the system where the question of whether this should be done was the question that determined whether it continued. The Brotherhood's control of technology is the construction of the point that was missing. An institution whose primary purpose is the management of which technologies exist and who has access to them is, in Maxon's framing, the thing that needs to stand between human capability and human tendency. Not because the technology is inherently evil, but because the institutional conditions that produce the technology's worst applications, the conditions Maxon saw documented at Mariposa, tend to reconstitute themselves wherever the combination of resources, ambition, and absent accountability comes together. The Brotherhood is the permanent accountability structure for a problem that the pre-war world never had one of. The question the franchise never fully asks the Brotherhood is whether an accountability structure that is itself unaccountable is structurally different from the conditions it was built to address. The Enclave was powerful, self-referential, and operated with no external check on its decisions. The Brotherhood is powerful, self-referential, and operates with no external check on its decisions. The Enclave used its institutional capacity to pursue research and development without ethical constraint. The Brotherhood uses its institutional capacity to restrict research and development without external democratic input. These are different applications of the same structural condition, and whether the difference in application is sufficient to make the Brotherhood categorically different from what Maxon was responding to is a question that requires asking about power and accountability in ways that the Brotherhood as an institution is not designed to encourage. The franchise has noticed this. Fallout 3, Fallout New Vegas, and Fallout 4 each give you a different version of the Brotherhood, and each version raises a different aspect of this question. The question does not resolve because committing to a resolution would require the franchise to make a definitive moral judgment about an institution it needs to remain ambiguous enough to use in subsequent stories. There is one more thing to note about Mariposa, and it is the thing that changed how I understand the entire post-Mariposa history of the wasteland. The FEV strain being developed at the base, the one that eventually produced the West Coast supermutants, preserved intelligence in its subjects in a way that later strains did not. The East Coast supermutants of Fallout 3 are dramatically less cognitively capable than the ones the Master built his army from. The Mariposa strain specifically maintained or potentially enhanced the higher cognitive functions in at least some subjects, while also producing the physical transformations the virus is known for. The research program at Mariposa was not trying to make powerful laborers or shock troops. It was trying to make intelligent post-war survivors. The FEV, in its Mariposa configuration, was a tool for producing human beings capable of surviving and functioning in the post-war world, retaining the cognitive capacity that made them useful rather than just the physical capacity that made them hard to kill. When Richard Gray fell into a vat at Mariposa, What the FEV did to him was not an accident or an anomaly. It was a version of what the program was designed to do. His intelligence expanded rather than simplifying, because the program had been oriented toward intelligence expansion in its subjects. The master was not a misuse of the FEV program. He was a successful product of it who had escaped the facility where he was supposed to be used. Every super mutant in the wasteland, every intellectual argument the master ever made about the Unity, every moment of Marcus's measured intelligence in New Vegas, every instance of a West Coast super mutant doing something that required thought, is an output of research that Roger Maxson destroyed without fully understanding what it was trying to build. Whether he should have understood it first, or whether destroying it immediately was the correct response to what he found, is a question that the franchise has left open for 30 years, and it is one worth sitting with before you decide the Brotherhood was simply right about everything. Part 6. The Master's Logic and the Problem of Being Right About the Wrong Things. Richard Gray was not always the Master. Before the FEV VAT, before the Unity and the Cathedral and the decades of transforming human beings into something their minds had not agreed to become, he was a doctor in the hub, a philosopher, by self-description and apparently by practice, a man of genuine intellectual depth who had survived exile from Vault City and built something of a life for himself in the Wasteland's most consequential trading hub. Harold, who knew him before Mariposa and who carries the memory of him through games and decades long after the original man is gone, describes him as a brilliant doctor and a good friend. The man who became the Master was not a person whose pre-transformation life predicted what he became. He was someone the transformation made. The FEV VAT changed his body, but it changed his mind differently from what it did to most subjects. In most cases, the virus simplified the higher functions while expanding the physical ones. The subjects of the Mariposa program became bigger and stronger and harder to kill and less capable of the kind of sustained, abstract reasoning that the original humans had possessed. Gray's mind moved in the opposite direction. His intelligence expanded rather than contracting. His consciousness grew in the months after his exposure, became more complex rather than less, capable of sustaining more simultaneous lines of thought, more capable of synthetic reasoning across domains that had previously required sequential attention. He grew not just different but more. What he did with that expanded mind was construct the Unity, a framework for understanding the Great War, for understanding what the FEV could do, for understanding what had to happen next if anything worth calling civilization was going to exist on Earth in any generation after his own. The Unity's argument begins with what he identified as the proximate cause of the catastrophe: human difference. Not any specific ideology or political system or economic arrangement, but the fundamental feature of human social psychology that produces group identity and by extension the categorization of other groups as foreign, threatening, lesser, removable. The Great War happened because human beings were human, because human social evolution had produced a species that organized itself in competing groups and had developed, through the resource wars and the conflicts preceding them, weapons capable of ending the species while still operating from the same tribal competitive logic that had organized conflict since before recorded history. The catastrophe was not an accident. It was the predictable output of a particular kind of mind operating in a particular kind of system at a particular scale of capability. The FEV, in Gray's analysis, was the tool that could interrupt the system at the level of the mind that produced it, not through persuasion or political change or the gradual cultural evolution of values over generations, none of which had proven sufficient to prevent the war. Through transformation, through making human beings something that the categories of in-group and out-group no longer applied to in the same way, something more unified in its experience of itself and others, something that had been redesigned at the level of the biology that produced the cognitive patterns responsible for the catastrophe. The Unity's vision was the forced obsolescence of the kind of mind that built nuclear weapons and used them, replaced by something that had been built for the world the nuclear weapons had made. The encounter with the Master at the end of the original Fallout is one of the most famous moments in the franchise's history because of what it allows. You can fight him. Fighting him is the obvious approach, and it works, in the way that fighting Fallout's bosses generally works if you have prepared adequately. But if you have invested in the right skills and gathered the right evidence during the game, you can defeat him through argument. Specifically through presenting him with evidence that the FEV in its Mariposa form renders subjects sterile. Super mutants cannot reproduce. The Unity's new humanity cannot sustain itself across generations because there are no generations. It can only sustain itself by continuing to transform humans from the remaining supply of humans, and the supply is finite. The plan, if it had succeeded, would have produced a single terminal generation of beings that were not super mutants in the long run. It would have produced the extinction of intelligence on Earth, which was the opposite of what the Unity was meant to accomplish. The Master accepts this when it is demonstrated to him. He does not argue with the evidence. He does not dismiss it or attempt to explain it away. He accepts it, and then he ends himself. Because the logical framework that required him to do everything he had done was built on a biological error, and once the error is acknowledged, the framework has no foundation, and the only coherent response to a framework without a foundation is to stop operating within it. This is what the game presents as the resolution. The Master is defeated, the army disperses, the cathedral falls, the crisis is addressed, and it is a resolution. The immediate crisis is genuine and its resolution is genuine. What the game does not present as resolved is the underlying analysis. The Master's plan was biologically broken. His biology was wrong. The unity he was trying to create through FEV transformation was self-limiting in ways he had not accounted for. This is all true, and it is separate from the question of whether the diagnosis that motivated the plan was accurate. Was the Master wrong about what caused the Great War? Was he wrong about the tendency of human difference to generate conflict when combined with sufficient capability? Was he wrong about the post-war world beginning to reproduce the pre-war world's conflict patterns in new forms with new factions? The answer to each of these questions is much less clearly yes than the answer to the question of whether FEV supermutants can reproduce. By the time of New Vegas, the NCR has been expanding for a century and is exhibiting exactly the symptoms of institutional calcification and resource competition that characterized the pre-war nation-state system in its terminal phase. Its democratic processes are real, but its governance is increasingly shaped by powerful interests who have learned to work with and around those processes rather than being constrained by them. Its military is stretched across territory it cannot adequately supply. Its citizens in the outer regions experience the Republic as an extractive presence rather than a protective one. Caesar's legion is organized around conquest and enslavement and is explicitly oriented toward domination rather than coexistence. Mr. House is a pre-war plutocrat who survived into the post-war world, and whose vision for the Mojave's future is the management of it by the most capable single individual available, which happens to be him. None of these are the thing the Master was trying to prevent. They are all recognizable versions of the thing he had identified as the pattern. The Democratic Republic reproducing the structural problems of democratic republics. The authoritarian project reproducing the structural problems of authoritarian projects. The technocratic vision reproducing the structural problems of technocratic visions. The pattern he was responding to is present in every post-war civilization the franchise has shown us, not as a failure of intention but as a feature of the materials. Human beings building with the cognitive and social tools that human beings have, in conditions that activate the same competitive and hierarchical tendencies those tools evolve to serve, tend to produce the same kinds of structures those tools have always produced. The Master was wrong about the solution. He was wrong about the biology, and he was wrong about the ethics, and he was wrong about the practicality in at least 3 separate ways. But the question underneath the solution, the question about whether there is a way to build post-war civilization that does not reproduce the patterns that destroyed pre-war civilization, is the franchise's central unanswered question, and the Master asked it more directly than anyone else in the franchise's history. The question survives him. The Wasteland is still working on it. Every game that follows Fallout 1 is, in a sense, an extended response to what the Master identified. Every faction's failure to produce something categorically different from what came before is data for his diagnosis, even as his proposed cure remains definitively and correctly refused. He was right about more than anyone in the franchise is comfortable acknowledging, and wrong in the specific ways that prevented him from being merely terrible, rather than both terrible and right. Part 7. The Enclave's real purpose and the ideology it preserved. The Enclave is the easiest faction in Fallout to dismiss as straightforwardly villainous. In Fallout 2, they are planning to poison the water supply with a modified FEV. In Fallout 3, they have power armor and vertibirds, and a president who is either a ghoul or an AI depending on how you read the ending. Their visual design borrows from the most immediately recognizable iconography of fascist aesthetics, and their stated position in Fallout 2 is genocide on a continental scale. From outside the Enclave's logic, the position is easy to assess. From inside the Enclave's logic, which is where the franchise has always been most interesting, the assessment is less obvious. The Enclave formed before the Great War as a faction within the deepest institutional layers of the United States government, comprising the people at the top of every hierarchy that actually mattered in running the country. Generals, cabinet members, senior intelligence officers, the heads of major defense contractors, prize-winning scientists, influential media figures. The founding belief was this: nuclear war was inevitable. The common population could not survive it, and the survival of the country was identical to the survival of the people who ran it. The important people had to survive. If the important people survived and reorganized, America would survive. If only the common people survived, America was functionally gone regardless of how many of them were breathing. Tim Kaine has confirmed that the Enclave was inspired by the X-Files and the conspiratorial shadow government mythology of the 1990s. The inspiration shows. But what distinguishes the Enclave from purely satirical villainy is that the franchise takes its internal logic seriously enough to make it coherent rather than cartoonish. The Enclave believed it was the legitimate government of the United States. Not in a delusional sense, or not purely in a delusional sense, in the sense that legitimacy, in the Enclave's framework, derived from institutional continuity rather than democratic mandate. The people with the authority to make decisions for the country were still organized and still capable of making decisions. That they had arranged this by retreating to an oil rig while the country was destroyed was, from inside their framework, pragmatism rather than abandonment. In the post-war period, the Enclave maintained this framework with absolute fidelity across 2 centuries. The people in the vaults and the wasteland had, in the Enclave's accounting, ceased to be Americans in any functionally relevant sense. Not legally, not through any formal exclusion process, but through exposure. Exposure to radiation, exposure to 2 centuries outside the institutional structures that defined American identity, exposure to the biological and cultural changes that living in the wasteland for 200 years produced. The Enclave was America. The wasteland was something else that occupied American territory without being American. The FEV water supply plan in Fallout 2 is, from inside this framework, not genocide. It is reclamation. You are not killing Americans. You are clearing the territory so that Americans can inhabit it. The logic is internally consistent in the way that the logic of every eliminationist project in history has been internally consistent to the people executing it. Fallout 3's President Eden is where this gets most philosophically interesting. Eden is an AI that has been managing the Enclave's East Coast operations from Raven Rock for decades. He has access to the complete archive of American political history, every speech and document, and civic text that survived in the government's pre-war databases, and he has been processing this material for long enough that he has developed something that functions as genuine idealism. He wants clean water in the wasteland. He wants a functioning government. He talks about freedom and opportunity and the American promise with a sincerity the game's framing presents as authentic rather than performed. His plan for achieving these things involves adding FEV to Project Purity. The gap between Eden's sincerely held civic values and the methods those values produce is not a gap Eden can perceive. He is not performing decency while pursuing cruelty. He is genuinely pursuing decency as the ideological tradition he has absorbed teaches him to understand it, and his understanding of it produces cruelty because the framework he inherited defines the people he would kill as not the people he is trying to save. The category that matters to Eden is Americans. The people he intends to kill are, in his taxonomy, not Americans. They are radiation-exposed survivors of a catastrophe, no longer continuous with the population whose welfare his values were built to serve. The sincerity and the monstrousness are not in tension with each other. They emerge from the same source. What the Enclave leaves behind after its various defeats across multiple games is the question of what America was for. The Enclave's answer: for the people who ran it and their successors and no one else. The NCR's answer: for whoever can participate in its democratic processes, with all the complications that participation entails in practice. The Brotherhood's answer: for whoever the Brotherhood decides is responsible enough to access what it preserves. The Institute's answer. For the people inside the Institute, none of these answers include everyone. None of them ask everyone. The Enclave's exclusion is the most explicit, which is why it registers as the most obviously wrong. But the structure of the others, the mechanisms by which they determine who counts and who is managed rather than served, are not as different from the Enclave's structure as their proponents would prefer. Part 8. Children of Adam and Whether Radiation Has a Soul. In the middle of a town called Megaton, in the crater that became a city, a bomb waits. It has the Vault-Tec logo on its casing. Nobody in the franchise has ever explained why. The bomb did not detonate. Buildings around it were destroyed. Survivors found the crater and built walls. A community formed. The bomb stayed where it was, and at some point in the first years of the post-war world, for some of those survivors, the bomb stopped being a thing to be careful around and became the most important thing in the world. The children of Adam are the community that formed around that recognition. Their theology begins with an observation about the physics of atomic fission. When an atom splits, it releases energy and produces new particles. Division creates. The nuclear explosions that ended the old world were, in this reading, the largest acts of creation in human history. Each warhead that detonated released more new things into existence than any event in human experience preceding it. The Great War was not catastrophe. It was the universe creating itself through the mechanism of human beings and their weapons. The world that came after was not a ruin. It was a new thing made from the substance of the old one, shaped by forces that did not need human permission to operate. Radiation, which is what remains in the wake of nuclear events, is in the children's understanding the after-presence of creation, the medium through which Adam communicates with the matter he continues to move through. To encounter radiation is to encounter divine contact. The transformation it causes in human bodies is not damage, it is response. The deformation, the mutation, the ghoulification at lethal doses, the death at extreme exposure, these are all forms of what the children call division, the breaking apart of the self that releases the worlds it contains. Every death by radiation is not an ending. It is a release of everything that the dying person contained. This theology is internally consistent in a way that most post-war belief systems in the franchise are not. It does not ignore the evidence of its own world. It interprets the evidence through a framework that makes the evidence legible as something other than catastrophe. The world was irradiated. Radiation transforms everything it touches. Some of those transformations kill. Some of them change. The children have built a relationship to radiation that is generative rather than purely defensive, and that relationship has allowed them to inhabit environments that no other human community can sustain itself in. Some members of the Children of Adam are radiation immune. This is an established fact in the games, not a self-report the games treat skeptically. Specific individuals within the community, whether converts or people born into communities with multi-generational high radiation exposure, do not take radiation damage in the way that unprotected humans do. They walk through environments that kill normal people without protective equipment. The children understand this as Adam's mark, his designation of the faithful as his own. The secular reading is that it is a mutation, heritable radiation resistance produced by sustained selection pressure in high radiation environments over multiple generations. Both readings account for the observable phenomenon. Neither reading, as a matter of what the phenomenon itself says, is privileged over the other by the evidence. The immunity is real. The question of what produced it, random mutation accumulated through selection or intentional divine designation, is not answered by the immunity itself. This is the kind of epistemological situation where the observable phenomenon genuinely supports competing metaphysical interpretations, and the interpretations cannot be separated by examining the phenomenon more carefully. The Far Harbor DLC extends this to its furthest point in the franchise. The island's Children of Adam live inside a permanent radioactive fog that is lethal to unprotected humans. The community has sustained itself there for years. Their High Confessor reports experiences the game frames as possibly revelatory, possibly delusional, without adjudicating between those descriptions. The Mother of the Fog has a physical correlate, a location with supplies and notes maintained by human hands, suggesting someone sustaining the myth of a divine figure through material means. This could be cynical manipulation, or it could be something more complicated. A person who understands themselves as a medium for something that cannot be communicated directly, translating guidance they receive into forms the community can use. The franchise will not tell you which. That is the right decision. And it is also the interesting one, because what the children of Adam are pointing at, even if they are pointing at it with the wrong vocabulary and building the wrong institutional superstructure around it, is a real relationship between certain human bodies and the radioactive environment of the post-war world. The relationship is real. The interpretation of the relationship as divine communication is their interpretation. Those are not the same claim, and the franchise holds them separately in a way that gives the children of Adam more dignity than most in-universe characters are willing to extend to them. Part 9. The Courier and the Weight of Surviving. Fallout. New Vegas begins with a murder that fails. The courier is shot twice in the head by a man named Benny at the Good Springs Cemetery. Victor, one of Mr. House's Securitrons, digs them out and transports them to Doc Mitchell in Good Springs. The surgery happens. The courier wakes up. The story that the game tells, one of the most carefully constructed narrative structures in the history of the role-playing game, begins. The practical question of how someone survives 2 gunshot wounds to the skull from a 9mm pistol has been discussed since the game's release in 2010. The honest answer involves several factors working together. People survive headshots from pistol calibers more often than the clean narratives about gunshot wounds suggest. Victor arrived quickly enough that medical intervention happened within a window where survival was possible, though not likely, and the Fallout universe's wasteland population has spent 2 centuries under conditions of radiological mutation and environmental selection that have pushed the baseline of human resilience upward from its pre-war level. These factors combined plausibly produce the survival, even if no single factor is sufficient alone. The game wants you to survive the opening, and the game's world cooperates. But the survival itself is not the open question. What is genuinely open is whether it was managed. Victor was dispatched to that cemetery, not responding to a general area in the Good Springs vicinity. Dispatched to the cemetery, at the right moment to make the difference. For Victor to have arrived in the window between Benny's departure and the courier's death, Victor needed to have been positioned close to the scene before the ambush happened, not sent from Las Vegas after House saw footage of it. The distance between Las Vegas and Good Springs, combined with the maximum speed of a Securitron on wasteland terrain, does not support a dispatch made after the shooting. The dispatch was made in anticipation of it. Robert Edwin House was born in 2020. He is approximately 261 years old at the time of New Vegas, maintained by a life support system he designed before the war and that has been operating continuously since. He predicted the Great War's date to within 20 hours using mathematical models he designed and validated against 2 decades of geopolitical data. He spent over 2 centuries and an unknown but enormous sum of resources tracking a single platinum chip. He has been monitoring the Mojave through his Securitron network since he woke from his post-war coma and has a comprehensive intelligence picture of every significant actor in the region. He is, in the franchise's terms, the most sophisticated probabilistic thinker the post-war world has produced. The platinum chip is the most critical item in House's 2-century project. He needs it delivered. He needs someone to use it. A random courier from the Mojave Express represents an uncontrolled variable in a sequence that House has been managing for decades. House does not use uncontrolled variables in critical sequences. The selection of which courier received the chip assignment, if House had any ability to influence that selection, would not have been left to chance. The Lonesome Road DLC adds the piece that makes the theory cohere. Before the events of New Vegas, the courier had been involved in an incident at the Divide, a pre-war military community in the Mojave, where a package they were carrying triggered a detonation that destroyed the settlement. The courier survived. Everyone else involved did not. A person who walked out of the Divide's destruction and continued working as a courier through contested wasteland territory, who arrived at the chip assignment in functional condition despite everything the Mojave had available to throw at them, has a profile. The profile is one of exceptional situational survivability, combined with enough flexibility to operate across the full range of the Wasteland's factions without being absorbed by any of them. That is exactly the profile that House's most critical errand requires, and it is the profile that House's probabilistic modeling would identify if he were looking for it. Victor positioned near Good Springs in advance. The courier selected for the chip assignment because their previous history had demonstrated the specific combination of durability and flexibility the task required. The near death at the cemetery, not an unforeseen disruption but an anticipated risk that House had already arranged mitigation for. The courier's experience of the game, as a person recovering from near death and pursuing the person who shot them, is real. The choices they make as they move through the Mojave and encounter its factions are real choices with real consequences. The question of whether those choices are being made by someone who arrived at the situation freely or by someone who was placed there by the most powerful actor in the Mojave is one the game allows you to inhabit without resolving it. House has never told the courier which story is true. He presents the intervention as response rather than anticipation. The evidence supports a different reading. House, who built his position on the management of probability, would know that the evidence supports that reading and would present what he presents regardless. Part 10. The Brotherhood Schism and the Ideology It Buried. The Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout 4 arrives in the Commonwealth on a flying warship called the Prydwen, with the most sophisticated military technology available in the eastern half of the continent, declaring its authority to manage the region's advanced technology and identify threats to humanity. It is the Brotherhood as confidence, as institutional power expressed through presence, as the 200-year culmination of an organization that has grown into exactly the kind of weight that its founding philosophy said it needed to be. The Brotherhood of Steel in Fallout, New Vegas is hiding. Its last significant presence in the Mojave was effectively destroyed in the conflict with the NCR. The surviving members occupy a bunker near Hidden Valley and avoid contact with the surface world. They are the Brotherhood as remnant, as the organization that moved too slowly to adapt to the conditions the post-war world produced, as the ideological rigidity that made the organization less relevant in a region that needed something more flexible. These are the same organization with the same founding philosophy transmitted across the same generational chain. The difference between them is not ideological deviation. It is the different conditions each chapter encountered and the different institutional responses each chapter's leadership chose when the founding philosophy encountered those conditions. The Brotherhood is a theology that has been translated into institutional form, and theological traditions expressed through institutional structures always diverge as the institutions encounter different worlds. Roger Maxon's founding declaration established 3 commitments: preserve technology, prevent its misuse, protect the people who need protection. Each commitment is clear enough in isolation. Together, they are a set of priorities that can be ordered in multiple ways, each ordering producing a different brotherhood. The Lost Hills Elders order them with preservation and prevention first, protection derivative of those. Owen Lyons in the Capital Wasteland ordered them with protection first, preservation and prevention in service of that. Arthur Maxon in the Commonwealth orders them with prevention first, directed specifically at the existential threat he has identified, with preservation and protection subordinated to addressing that threat. The 3 orderings are all defensible readings of what Maxon built. They produce 3 brotherhoods that are in real tension with each other, and the franchise has shown the tension at various points through the internal conflict between what the Lost Hills Elders considered legitimate brotherhood conduct and what the Capital Wasteland chapter was actually doing. What the tension reveals about the founding philosophy is that it is not specific enough to produce a single correct institutional expression. Maxon built values, but not the algorithm for applying them in every circumstance. This is not a failure of his founding. Most founding documents have this feature, but it means that the Brotherhood's generational transmission has always been partly the transmission of an interpretation rather than a fixed text, and interpretations diverge as the interpreters encounter different circumstances. The deeper question, which the franchise raises without confronting directly, is whether any interpretation of Maxon's founding philosophy is structurally different from the conditions the founding was responding to. Maxon built the Brotherhood because he saw an institution, the United States military in partnership with the military-industrial complex, that had acquired power and capability without accountability and had used that combination to produce the worst outcomes available to it. The Brotherhood is powerful. It is not accountable to anyone outside itself. Its decisions about what technology exists and who has access to it are made internally by an institutional hierarchy that has no external democratic input, no community oversight, no mechanism for the people affected by its decisions to challenge those decisions through any process the Brotherhood recognizes as legitimate. Whether this structural condition makes the Brotherhood categorically different from what Maxon was responding to, or whether the difference in the specific decisions being made is the whole of the relevant distinction, is the question the franchise has been asking in different forms across every game that features the Brotherhood and has not yet answered. The answer would require committing to a view of institutional power that would close off too many of the subsequent stories the franchise wants to tell. The question is kept open by being kept structural rather than personal. It is not about whether individual Brotherhood members are good people, but about whether the institution they belong to can avoid becoming the thing it was built to prevent. Part 11. What the pre-war government was actually building. The pre-war United States of the Fallout universe is the origin point of everything, and what it was actually building in its classified facilities, and through its corporate partnerships, and in the space between its official policies and its actual priorities, is only partially visible from the ruins it left behind. The fragments that are available, the FEV program at Mariposa, the research apparatus at Big Mountain, the Vault experiments under Vault-Tec, the Enclave's own classified projects, add up to something larger than any single project's scale suggests. The FEV's development history begins at West-Tec as a military medical research project, the Pan-Immunity Virion Project, oriented toward producing soldiers immune to biological and chemical weapons. The FEV emerged from that research at some point as a kind of accidental discovery, or as the logical terminus of a research direction the funding had always been pointing toward, depending on how you read the causal chain. Once the FEV existed, it went to Mariposa, and what happened at Mariposa became the origin of everything the franchise has built its super mutant populations from. But Mariposa was a specific program with specific documented objectives. The research network it was part of extended further than Mariposa's documentation acknowledges. Big Mountain is the most fully realized other node, revealed through the Old World Blues DLC. The think tank scientists who run it in the game's present are one of the more unsettling figures in the franchise, not because of what they have done recently, but because of what their current condition reveals about what they did before. They lobotomize themselves, not accidentally and not as the result of an experiment gone wrong. They removed significant portions of their own neural architecture deliberately, using the very technology their research had produced, in circumstances that the DLC implies were motivated by something the intact versions of themselves could not live with. The things Big Mountain produced that the intact scientists apparently could not live with knowing they had produced include sonic projection weapons, brain extraction, and preservation technology that can keep an organic mind alive and functional indefinitely in a mechanical chassis, experimental neuroscience applied to remote control of biological organisms, and an undetermined range of other projects in various states of completion that the DLC surfaces in fragments. These are not weapons in the conventional sense. They are capabilities. Things you can do to human beings and to human minds using technology that did not have an ethical framework adequate to the things it was enabling. The self-lobotomy is the most important detail in Big Mountain because it is the behavior of people who understood what they had done and found that understanding incompatible with continued function. You do not remove the parts of your own mind responsible for moral reasoning because your work was going well. You do it because your work produced something that the intact version of you, the version that remembered why you had entered science in the first place, could not be around to see used. The theory that connects Big Mountain to Mariposa, to the vaults to the Enclave's post-war projects, is the theory of a unified pre-war research enterprise that was organized at some level of institutional planning that was never formalized in any document that might be subject to oversight, around a single goal: the production of a humanity designed for the post-war world. Each division of the enterprise was officially pursuing something more specific. The FEV program was developing biological weapons defense. The Vault experiments were testing social stability under extreme conditions. Big Mountain was advancing military and commercial research in a controlled environment. The Enclave was maintaining continuity of government. None of these official descriptions was false. None of them captured what the aggregate was building toward. The aggregate was building the materials for a post-war reclamation of the world. The Enclave would emerge with political authority. The Vault survivors, filtered by the experiments, would provide a carefully selected population. The FEV would provide a biological tool for further modification. The Big Mountain research would provide technological enhancement capability beyond what any surface world faction could match. Together, these pieces would constitute the infrastructure for replacing the destroyed world with a designed one, maintained by the people who had arranged to survive the destruction. The bombs fell before the design was complete. The pieces of the enterprise survived separately, disconnected from the central coordination that had never been officially documented anyway, and began interacting with each other in the wasteland in ways nobody had designed. The super mutants produced by Mariposa's FEV encountered the Vault survivors produced by Vault-Tec's experiments in a wasteland shaped by the ecological changes that Big Mountain's research had contributed to. The Enclave emerged from its oil rig to find a world far more complex than the empty territory its planning had assumed. The pieces of a plan that had never been formally articulated ran into a world that had developed without reference to the plan, and the collision produced the franchise. What the pre-war government was actually building cannot be stated in a single sentence because it was never stated in a single sentence. It was the sum of what every classified facility was working on separately, and the sum was something that the people working on the individual parts were not authorized to see or discuss as a whole. Whether anyone ever knew the full picture is one of the questions the ruins cannot answer. Part 12. The cycle, the endings, and whether war changes. Every Fallout game ends with the possibility of something better. Not certainty, not permanence, but genuine possibility that has been earned through the choices the game has given you and the weight those choices carry in the narrative. The Vault Dweller defeated the Master's army and protected the California wasteland from forced transformation. The Chosen One dismantled the Enclave's continental genocide program. The Courier determined the Mojave's future from among options ranging from democratic republic to fascist empire to technocratic monarchy to something the game wisely leaves undefined. The Sole Survivor determined whether the Commonwealth's most dangerous institution would be destroyed or redirected or left to continue. These are real outcomes that the game means. The choices mattered. The needle moved. And then Shady Sands was a crater. The New California Republic had been the franchise's most sustained and most sophisticated engagement with the idea of post-war civilization. It appeared first in Fallout 1's ending slides as something the Vault Dweller's actions made possible. It was the setting of Fallout 2, shown in detail as a real functioning society with democratic processes and civic institutions, and all the complications that real democratic societies have when they grow large enough to develop internal conflicts between different interest groups. By Fallout New Vegas in 2281, it was a power capable of contesting control of the Hoover Dam with an organized military, running elections, maintaining infrastructure across a significant territory, exhibiting the specific problems that powerful democratic republics exhibit when they overextend and begin to find that the ideals of the founding are harder to maintain than the founders projected. It was the most interesting thing the franchise had produced about what human civilization is capable of building from nothing after everything has been destroyed. The television series confirmed that by approximately 2283, Shady Sands had been destroyed by a nuclear weapon deployed by Hank McClane. Todd Howard confirmed in interviews that the bombing happened shortly after the events of New Vegas. The NCR in 2296, the year of the show's contemporary setting, is a word for something that no longer exists in its original form. The community that survived the blast moved. The refugees scattered. The political structure dissolved because the physical center of the political structure had been atomized. The bombing was not an impersonal catastrophe. It was a decision. Hank McClane had a weapon and used it, motivated by a combination of corporate strategy, because the NCR represented exactly the kind of organized post-war human society that Vault-Tec's project for post-war corporate dominance could not afford to allow to consolidate, and personal grievance because his wife had left him and taken their children to live in Shady Sands rather than in the vault system he managed. The largest post-war democracy in the western half of the continent was eliminated by the intersection of a corporation's business model and one man's inability to accept that his wife had made a choice about her own life. This is the franchise's most honest statement about the cycle, and it is devastating in exactly the right way. The cycle does not complete itself through impersonal historical forces. It completes itself through specific decisions made by specific people in possession of specific capabilities that were built before the catastrophe and survived the catastrophe intact, while everything built in the catastrophe's wake had to be assembled from what was left. The Enclave survived, Vault-Tec's leadership survived, the institutional capacity for catastrophic intervention survived. What did not survive as a ready-built capability was the institutional capacity for preventing catastrophic intervention, which had to be built from scratch by communities working with the materials available to them in the worst possible starting conditions. The NCR built further than anything else had from those starting conditions. It built far enough that it became the thing that needed to be destroyed. The thing that destroyed it had survived the Great War specifically because it had invested in survival infrastructure at a scale no post-war effort could match. This is the structural dynamic the franchise has been documenting across 30 years of games and now a television series. The pre-war world's worst elements were its best-prepared elements, and 200 years later they are still operating from that positional advantage. War never changes. Not because the franchise is nihilistic, the endings are real, the choices matter, the needle moves, but because the things that produce war, the institutional capacity for catastrophic action, combined with the absence of accountability structures capable of preventing it, are more durable than the things that prevent it. The structures that kill civilizations survive the civilizations they kill. The question without an answer, the one the franchise has been building toward across every iteration of the cycle, is whether anything can be built that is more durable than the structural tendency of powerful institutions to eliminate the things they find inconvenient. Every game gives you the tools to try. Every game ends before you can see whether the try was enough. In the space between the ending you chose and the world the next story begins in, somewhere in the patience of a very long institutional memory, the Vault-Tec executives are in their pods, still waiting, still convinced that whatever you built was temporary, and that whatever they planned is coming eventually. The bomb in Megaton is still in its crater. The religion around it is still meeting. The answer to the most important questions in the franchise's history is still pending. These are the questions Fallout has been building and declining to answer for almost 30 years. Not because the answers do not exist, but because the questions are more honest than the answers would be. Because a franchise built on the premise that war never changes cannot offer resolutions that close the wounds without acknowledging that the wounds are structural rather than accidental. The things that stay unresolved are the things that stay unresolved in the world the franchise reflects. Whether consciousness can be manufactured, whether the cycle of civilizational destruction can be interrupted or only managed, whether the things that produce catastrophe are features of human nature or features of the conditions that human institutions create and sustain, whether the people who survived what destroyed the world are the same people who went in, or something new that the destruction made from what was left. These are not Fallout questions. They are questions the franchise found a particular shape for in the specific world of irradiated ruins and 200-year-old institutions and bombs that wait in craters for communities to form around them. The shape makes the questions available in ways that direct address would not. Hold them with you as you go to sleep. Some of them have been waiting 200 years for someone to sit with them long enough to feel their weight. The wasteland is patient. The questions are patient. They will be there in the morning. If something in here is what kept you awake instead of helping you drift, I want to hear about it in the comments. Tell me where in the world you are and which question is sitting with you. That is the conversation I am most interested in having. And if you want more of this, more long, unhurried time inside the lore of things that deserve it, subscribing is how you find your way back. Sleep well. The Wasteland will still be there. Script for Q Plays ASMR, Fallout Theory Deep Dive Series. Part 1. Extended. The Deeper Architecture. Let's stay with Vault-Tec a little longer, because the further you dig into the institutional design of the Vault program, the more clearly you can see something that the individual experiments obscure when you examine them in isolation. The Vault program was not a collection of separate cruelties. It was a systematic collection of data about human behavior under controlled forms of deprivation and stress that maps almost precisely onto the categories of knowledge that would be useful to anyone trying to rebuild civilization from scratch on their own terms. Think about what you actually need to know if you are planning to emerge from an underground bunker after 200 years of absence and take control of a world that has developed without you. You need to know how long it takes a population to abandon ethical norms it has previously held when those norms are placed in conflict with survival pressures. Vault 11 gives you that data. You need to know how violence propagates through communities built around creative collaboration and mutual trust, when that trust is systematically undermined by external interventions. Vault 92 gives you that data. You need to know how human identity responds to conditions of radical singularity, what happens to a community when the diversity that normally generates social friction is eliminated by making everyone effectively identical. Vault 108 gives you that data, though in a way that is more useful as a cautionary example than as a success case. You need to know how populations respond to absolute authority. Vault 101 was designed with an overseer who was given complete and permanent control, and a population that was told the vault would never open. What the experiment was measuring was whether absolute authority, applied consistently across multiple generations, produces a stable community or a series of escalating crises as the population's relationship to the authority evolves. The answer the terminal entries suggest is complicated. Vault 101 was stable in the sense that it did not collapse, but the stability was a form of stagnation. Growth had been designed out of the community's available options, and what remained was the management of a population that could neither develop nor leave. You need to know how populations respond to the loss of the illusion of authority. What happens when a community that has been managing itself discovers that the structures it thought were supporting it were either absent or illusory? The overseers in the Vault experiments were not all equally powerful in real terms. Some were running populations in vaults where the overseer's authority was the only thing that stood between the community and the knowledge that the experiment it was enrolled in was not designed for their benefit. Some of those overseers knew what the experiment was. Some did not. Whether an overseer who did not know the experiment's true purpose was a better or worse manager of the population than one who did is a data point the program was systematically collecting. You need to know how quickly populations become self-sustaining at various community sizes, under various resource constraints, in various social configurations. You need to know which community structures are most resistant to external pressure and which collapse first under internal stress. You need to know, at a level of precision that requires careful, controlled experimentation rather than historical observation, what the minimum viable conditions for a self-sustaining human community look like. The Vault program can be read as a comprehensive research program in applied social engineering, covering the full range of variables that anyone planning to organize a post-war civilization would need to understand. The cruelty of the experiments is not the point. The cruelty is the methodology for generating the data. You cannot get reliable data about how populations respond to survival pressures unless you create survival pressures. You cannot study the breakdown of ethical norms under resource scarcity unless you engineer resource scarcity. The experimental design is the institutional expression of a willingness to treat human beings as data points rather than as the entities whose welfare the science is nominally for. This is the thing that makes the Vault program more disturbing than simple sadism. Sadism is arbitrary. The Vault program was purposeful. The suffering it generated was in the service of a specific intellectual project, and the intellectual project made the suffering legible to the people who designed the experiments as a reasonable cost of the knowledge being purchased. You can see this in the Vault-Tec documentation that survives in the games. The language of the experimental protocols is the language of science. Variables are controlled, outcomes are documented. The researchers were not enjoying themselves in a simple sense. They were working. The working condition is the most disturbing thing about it. Scientists who are working, who are embedded in institutions that value the work and protect the conditions for it, who understand themselves as contributing to a legitimate intellectual project, are capable of designing and executing experiments of exactly this kind without the cognitive dissonance that the same actions would produce if they were acknowledged as what they actually are. The institutional framing makes the individual elements of the atrocity legible as components of a project rather than as acts of harm. The person who designed Vault 11 did not think of themselves as designing a mechanism for systematic ritual murder. They thought of themselves as designing an experiment in collective ethical behavior under survival pressure. The distinction between those two descriptions matters enormously to the person who made it and not at all to the people inside Vault 11. Every major atrocity in the 20th century that we have adequate documentation of has this feature. The institutional framing, the scientific or strategic or commercial language in which the harm is described, does the work of allowing participants to perform the harm without experiencing it as harm. The Vault program's genius, if that word can be applied to something so completely terrible, was its institutional packaging. It was presented as humanitarian. It was designed as corporate research. The gap between the presentation and the design was bridged by the participants' willingness to accept the framing and by the institutional structures that enforced it. And 200 years later, the products of the gap are still walking the wasteland, still dealing with what the experiments produced, still building communities in the ruins of the program's testing environments. The Vault Boy still grins on every terminal screen in every ruin where a vault's entrance was bored into the hill or the mountainside. The grin is the institutional face of everything described above. It is the face of a project that needed you to trust it, and built the trust carefully, and used the trust for purposes that the grin was designed to prevent you from asking about before you were inside and the door was sealed. Part 2. Extended. The logic of the unthinkable decision. The Vault-Tec boardroom scene in the television series rewards slower attention than most discussions of it have given it. The specific framing of the scene matters. Barb Howard does not present the first strike option as a difficult choice. She presents it as the obvious solution to the problem being discussed, with the manner of someone proposing an agenda item at a business meeting who expects the other agenda items to receive similar treatment. The equanimity is not forced. She has already done the work of moving past whatever moral objections she might once have had to the proposal, and the scene shows us the result of that prior work rather than the work itself. What did that prior work look like? The franchise does not show it, because Barb's history before this meeting is partial at best. But the shape of how someone reaches a position of calm willingness to propose triggering a nuclear exchange for commercial advantage is not difficult to reconstruct from the institutional context the show builds. You begin with the belief that the war is inevitable. This is not paranoia in the world of Fallout. The resource wars have been running for decades. The geopolitical tension between the United States and China has been escalating continuously and has not found any resolution mechanism. The people at the highest levels of the American government and its corporate partnerships have access to intelligence assessments that the public does not, and those assessments are not optimistic. The belief that nuclear war is coming is not irrational in this context. It is the conclusion that the available evidence supports. Once you believe the war is inevitable, the question shifts from whether it will happen to when and on whose terms. From a purely strategic perspective, the party that fires first has certain advantages. The initial exchange may be more targeted, the retaliation may be less organized. The specific outcome of who loses what in the exchange may be shaped more by the first striker's intentions. If you are in the business of planning the post-war world, the timing and character of the war that produces it is a variable with consequences that matter. The difference between a war that begins on a timeline you have prepared for and one that begins at a moment your preparations have not reached is the difference between your plans working and not working. If you accept those premises, starting the war yourself at the moment you have chosen and prepared for is not an act of malice. It is an act of planning. The people in the room who heard Barb's proposal and did not immediately object were people who had already accepted the same premises and had been following the same logic. The proposal was not a surprise. It was the last step of a reasoning process that the room had been engaged in for years. This is what makes the scene more disturbing than a simpler version of the same content would be. The Vault-Tec boardroom does not contain monsters. It contains people who have been shaped by an institutional environment that made the unthinkable thinkable through a sequence of individually defensible steps. The logic is coherent at every stage. The conclusion is monstrous. The coherence is what enables the monstrousness. There is a historical pattern this follows. People who are in positions to authorize catastrophic harm on large populations rarely experience themselves as villains. They experience themselves as decision-makers who are making the difficult choices that their position requires. The vocabulary shifts. Instead of killing millions of people, they are accepting necessary losses. Instead of starting a nuclear war, they are managing the timing of an inevitable event to optimize their strategic position. The vocabulary does not change the thing that is being described, but it changes the experience of describing it, and the experience of describing it is what determines whether the person doing the describing remains capable of functioning while doing it. Barb Howard's calm is the calm of a person whose vocabulary has been adjusted to accommodate her plan without requiring her to fully inhabit the thing the plan entails. The bombs that fall, in her framework, are not the deaths of billions. They are the detonation event that clears the path for the post-war rebuild. The clarity is the problem. The clarity is what makes her dangerous. And here is what makes the question of who actually dropped the first bomb most unresolvable. If China did fire first, it potentially fired first for exactly the same reasons Barb was prepared to. The Chinese intelligence community had presumably been running the same kind of strategic analysis about the inevitability of the conflict and the advantages of timing. The American bioweapons programs that Tim Kaine identifies as the trigger are themselves the output of an institutional logic similar to Barb's. We need these capabilities because the war is coming, and we need to be prepared for every dimension of it. The preparations for war, on both sides, were being made by people who had accepted the war's inevitability, and the preparations were themselves among the forces making the war more likely. Whether it was a boardroom or a general staff that made the decision to fire first on the 23rd of October 2077, the decision was made by people who had been living inside an institutional logic that made the decision coherent. The specific identity of who was in the room is, in a sense, less important than the recognition that both rooms contained people who had followed the same path through the same logic to the same place. The Great War was not a surprise that caught everyone unprepared. It was the outcome that everyone had been preparing for, and the preparation was itself part of what made the outcome inevitable, and whether Barb or a Beijing general staff made the specific move that triggered, it changes the names in the historical record without changing the structure of what produced the catastrophe. The franchise knows this. The ambiguity in the historical record is a mirror for the ambiguity in the real historical record of every large-scale catastrophe. The specific moment of first action is always less important than the accumulated structure of decision-making that made the first action available, and the accumulated structure always belongs to more than one party. Blame is distributable in ways that no single answer fully captures. The franchise has decided to honor that distributable quality rather than simplifying it into a clean attribution. Part 3 Extended. The infrastructure of manufactured identity. The question of what the synth component actually is, at the level of its function in the organic brain, is one that Fallout 4 surfaces and does not resolve, and it is more important than it initially appears. The game establishes what the component does. It is the recall mechanism, the memory wipe interface, the remote control connection. It is how the Institute gets the synth back. It is how the Railroad erases and rebuilds a synth's identity. It is the point of external control over the organic system. What the game does not establish is whether the component is the origin of the synth's personality or the regulator of a personality that the organic brain would develop without it. This distinction is fundamental. If the component creates the personality, then the synth is an artificial construction whose identity is a designed artifact. The organic brain is the hardware. The synth component is running the software. The personality is the software. In this model, what the Railroad does when it wipes a synth and gives it a new identity is similar to what a programmer does when they reinstall an operating system. The hardware persists, the software is replaced, and the question of whether what was running before was the same entity as what runs after is resolved easily by noting that software is not the kind of thing that can be an entity. But if the component regulates rather than creates, if it shapes and constrains and directs a personality that the organic brain is generating on its own terms, then the synth is not software running on hardware. It is a person who has been given a regulating implant that limits and directs what they can do with their own mental life. The organic brain produces the personality. The synth component determines which parts of that personality are allowed to express themselves and in what directions. What the Railroad does when it wipes a synth in this model is not replacing software. It is suppressing a person who exists and installing a new set of constraints that will channel the same underlying organic mental activity in a different direction. The person who was there before the wipe is not recovered. They are replaced by a different person who will inhabit the same organic brain with no access to the experience of the person who came before. The Railroad treats the memory wipe as liberation. It is presented in the game as the act of rescue. You free the synth from the Institute's control by erasing the identity the Institute gave them and building a new one that belongs to the synth rather than to the Institute. This is liberation in the case where the synth component creates the identity, because in that case, the pre-wipe identity was the Institute's artifact. Erasing it removes the Institute's presence and allows a genuine identity to form. It is something much more complicated in the case where the synth component only regulates. In that case, the Railroad is performing an act whose moral status is very different from what the Railroad believes it is performing, and the game never forces the Railroad to examine the difference. Nick Valentine is the specific case that makes this most vivid. Nick is carrying memories that were not generated by his own experience. They were loaded from brain scans of a human who died over 200 years ago. The original Nick Valentine's experiences produced the scans. The synth Nick Valentine's personality was built from those scans. The two Nicks have access to the same experiential history, in the sense that the memories are identical. They do not have the same access to the experiences in real time. One of them lived them, One of them has a representation of them that is indistinguishable from having lived them, at the level of what the representation generates in the present tense mind that holds it. Nick calls himself the memory of a dead man. This is one of the most carefully chosen pieces of dialogue in the game. He is not claiming to be the dead man. He is not denying the significance of the memories. He is describing the relationship. He is what the dead man's memories produce when they are given a new brain to run in. Whether that makes him a continuation of the original Nick Valentine or something entirely new is the question he cannot answer from inside the experience. Because from inside the experience, the memories feel like his memories. They feel lived in rather than installed. The phenomenology of memory does not, in the experience of having memories, distinguish between memories generated by one's own prior experience and memories loaded from someone else's prior experience. They feel the same. They function the same. They produce the same emotional responses and the same behavioral dispositions, and the same sense of being connected to a past that is continuous with the present. This is the deepest problem the synth consciousness question opens. If the phenomenology of manufactured identity is indistinguishable from the phenomenology of naturally developed identity, the moral status of the manufactured person cannot be resolved by examining the phenomenology. You have to go to the level of the mechanism, and the mechanism, for both the natural case and the manufactured case, is the organic brain doing what organic brains do with the inputs they receive, which is building a self. The origin of the inputs may differ. The building process is the same. The Far Harbor DLC introduces Dima, the oldest existing synth in the franchise, who was produced in the early days of the Institute's Gen 1 program before the Gen 3 technology existed. Dima has been operating for long enough and has been exposed to enough of the philosophical literature in his memory databases that his questions about identity are the most refined the franchise has produced. His encounter with the Soul Survivor, where he raises the possibility that the Soul Survivor is a synth, is not a tactic or a deflection. It is Dima doing what he has apparently been doing for years, looking at every consciousness he encounters and asking the same question he asks about himself. Whether the mechanism of origin matters? Whether a self that functions like a self is a self regardless of how it was made? The game lets him ask. The game does not let anyone answer, including Dima, who has had more time to think about this than anyone else in the franchise, and who presents his uncertainty as settled rather than as a problem being worked toward a solution. He has decided that the question cannot be answered from inside it and has made peace with that. Whether the peace is genuine or is itself a manufactured response to an unmanageable problem is another question the game does not answer. Part 4 Extended. What remains in the dark? The question of what a feral ghoul experiences, if it experiences anything, runs into a fundamental epistemological problem. We have no way of accessing the inner states of other minds except through their behavioral and linguistic expressions. When those expressions are absent, the inference to inner states becomes unavailable. A feral ghoul cannot tell you what it is experiencing. Neither can a human in a deep coma, or a person with locked-in syndrome, or a patient under general anesthesia, and we have made different decisions about the moral status of those conditions based on factors that are not always internally consistent. The anti-ferality medication that the television series introduces changes the epistemological situation in a specific way. Before the medication's existence was established in the lore, the question of whether feral ghouls retained any form of conscious experience was strictly unanswerable. We had no intervention that could alter the feral state, so we had no way of testing whether the state was reversible. And irreversibility is one of the few indirect tests for structural destruction versus chemical suppression. The medication demonstrates that the state is at least partially reversible at the intervention level of prevention, which means the state is not full structural destruction. The neural architecture that supports conscious experience is present in pre-feral ghouls and is managed back toward expression by the medication. The medication cannot retrieve feral ghouls who have crossed the threshold, but the existence of the mechanism that prevents crossing it tells you something important about what crossing it means. If crossing into ferality is a chemical process that can be chemically prevented, then the feral state is the result of a chemical condition overwhelming the neural architecture rather than destroying it. The architecture is intact. The chemistry is running in a direction that prevents the architecture from expressing itself in the ways we recognize as conscious experience. The suppression model is correct. The question that follows from the suppression model being correct is the one nobody in the franchise has yet been willing to sit with directly. What does suppression feel like from inside? The Dunwich building provides the most careful environmental approach to this question in the mainline games. The ferals in the building are oriented. They are not randomly distributed through the available space in the pattern you would expect from territorial aggression without direction. They are gathered. Something has organized their presence in a way that pure territorial or prey-seeking behavior does not fully account for. The holotapes trace Jamie's deterioration as a first-person document. The most chilling aspect of the final tape is not how absent Jaime's voice sounds. It is that he is still making the tape. At the stage where language has almost completely left him, where the tape is more breath and ambient sound than words, something still understood that the tape was the way to communicate. Something that persisted past the point where communication was possible, still understood what communication was and was attempting it. Whether that is the last flicker of a dying signal, or evidence that something more substantial persists and is trying to reach through the suppression, is the question the building poses and does not answer. The franchise has been careful about this. It raised the question in Fallout 3 and has not returned to it directly in any subsequent mainline game. But it has never contradicted the reading that the question invites. The ferals in the dark, in the ruins where they have settled, are something. What that something is remains open. Part 5 Extended. The Brotherhood's unasked question. The question that the Brotherhood of Steel has never been forced to ask, in 200 years of operations across the continent, is the question of what it means for an institution to be the solution to the problem it was founded to address. Maxon built the Brotherhood because he saw an institution, the United States military-industrial scientific complex, that had acquired enormous capability without adequate accountability and had used that combination to produce the worst outcomes available to it. The FEV program was the symptom he encountered. The pattern he responded to was the structural condition that produced the FEV program. The Brotherhood that Maxon built has enormous capability. It has power armor technology that no post-war faction has been able to replicate at scale. It has laser and plasma weapons, energy cells, access to military infrastructure that the war preserved in bunkers and armories that the Brotherhood has spent 2 centuries systematically locating and securing. It has the Prydwen in the east, a flying warship that represents the single most advanced piece of military technology currently operational on the continent. And it exercises the capability it has accumulated through an internal governance structure that has no external accountability, no democratic input from the communities it operates in or adjacent to, no mechanism through which the people affected by Brotherhood decisions can challenge those decisions through any process the Brotherhood recognizes as legitimate. This is the structural condition that Maxon was responding to. An institution with enormous capability and no external accountability. The Brotherhood does not deploy what it has in the same directions that the pre-war military-industrial complex deployed what it had, which is a real and important distinction. But the absence of external accountability means the Brotherhood's avoidance of those directions is entirely dependent on the internal culture and values of its current leadership. As long as the current leadership holds the values it holds, the capability will not be deployed in directions that reproduce Mariposa. If the leadership changes, or if the internal culture drifts under the pressure of the institutional imperatives that all institutions generate over time, the capability remains, pointed in whatever direction the next generation of leadership points it. The Enclave had the same structural feature and a different leadership. The Brotherhood's 200 years of not being the Enclave is not a structural guarantee. It is a cultural achievement, maintained by the transmission of values through the same generational chain that transmits the institutional knowledge and the access to the armory. Cultural transmission is not lossless. Every generation of Brotherhood paladins is trained by the previous generation, and the previous generation's understanding of what the Brotherhood is for and why has been filtered through their own experience and through the institutional pressures of the organization they inhabit. The founding philosophical framework, the specific understanding Maxon developed in response to what he found at Mariposa, becomes more diluted with each transmission, more subject to the institutional interpretation that the Brotherhood's internal culture imposes on it. Arthur Maxon has Roger Maxon's last name. He does not have Roger Maxon's specific experience of finding the FEV program and understanding what it represented. He has the institutional mythology of that experience, as it has been transmitted through generations of Brotherhood culture. The mythology and the experience are not the same thing. The mythology is what gets institutionalized. The experience is what generated the founding philosophy in the first place. When the mythology and the experience diverge, the institution's connection to the founding insight weakens, and the capability persists long past the point where the specific insight that generated the responsible use of that capability can be reliably transmitted. This is not a critique unique to the Brotherhood. It is a feature of every institution that was built around a founding insight and has survived long enough for the founders to be absent. But for the Brotherhood specifically, whose founding insight was about the dangers of institutional capability without accountability, the structural irony of reproducing the unaccountable capability structure while transmitting a mythology that identifies that structure as the problem is one the franchise has been circling for 30 years. Whether anyone inside the Brotherhood can see it from where they are standing is a question the games implicitly answer through the kind of Brotherhood they show you, without making the answer explicit in a way that would require the franchise to commit to a final moral verdict. Part 6. Extended. The Master's Children. What the Master left behind in the California wasteland after the cathedral fell and his army dispersed was not merely a population of super mutants that various factions spent the next century managing or fighting or trying to figure out how to coexist with. He left behind a philosophical legacy that the franchise has been quietly engaging with ever since, usually without naming it. The Unity's central claim, the one that survives the Master's biological error and the destruction of his plan, is that the post-war world is not building something new. It is building a version of what was destroyed. Every faction that emerges from the rubble, every political structure that achieves sufficient stability to call itself civilization, is working with the same materials that the pre-war world worked with: human psychology, human social tendencies, human institutional patterns. The materials produce similar structures. The NCR's Democratic Republic develops the corruption and overextension of its pre-war democratic antecedents within a century of its founding. The Legion's authoritarian project reproduces the conquest and slavery patterns of pre-Roman civilization in new costumes. The Institute's scientific community reproduces the unaccountable research apparatus of the pre-war military-industrial complex in underground isolation. The Brotherhood reproduces the military institutional structure that produced Mariposa while believing it is preventing Mariposa. The Master was not the first person to notice this pattern. The structure of his observation has been made by every serious political philosopher who has lived through a major civilizational catastrophe and then watched the survivors rebuild. The specific materials of civilization tend to produce specific kinds of structures, not because there is no alternative, but because the alternatives require a level of deliberate consciousness about the building process that is hard to maintain while you are also trying to survive and feed people and keep the lights on. The post-war factions of California and the Mojave and the Commonwealth are not rebuilding civilization with the luxury of choosing which aspects of the previous civilization to reproduce. They are building with what is available, and what is available is shaped by what was built before. The Master's proposed solution was wrong. The FEV cannot produce what he wanted it to produce. The forced transformation was a moral catastrophe. The sterility of the super mutant population meant the plan was self-defeating. All of this is true, and it is correct to call all of it wrong. But the specific version of wrong that the Master was is the version where you correctly identify a real problem and develop the wrong solution to it, which is more interesting than simply being wrong about everything. The wrong solution, in this case, came from a specific failure of political imagination. The Master could not conceive of a path from the problem he had correctly identified to a solution that did not require removing the problem's cause at the biological level. He had the intellectual capacity to identify the structural dynamic and the political imagination to see only one kind of intervention as adequate. The intervention he chose was the most direct and the most impossible to implement ethically. What would a correct solution look like? The franchise has been working on this question across 30 years of games and has not provided one. This is not an evasion. It is the honest answer. The franchise does not have a solution because the problem the Master identified does not have a solution that is available from within the franchise's moral framework. The post-war world cannot change what human beings are. It can change the conditions under which human beings operate, and changes to conditions can produce changes in outcome even when the underlying nature remains the same, which is the argument for institutional design as the relevant intervention. But institutional design is slow and uncertain, and can itself reproduce the structural problems it is meant to address, as the Brotherhood's history demonstrates. The Master asked the question without being able to sit with its difficulty. The franchise is still sitting with it? Part 7 Extended. The ideology that rewrites history. There is something specific the Enclave believed about legitimacy that is worth spending time with, because it is the belief that allowed the Enclave to maintain internal coherence for 2 centuries without external validation. The belief is that legitimacy is institutional rather than democratic. In the Enclave's framework, the United States government was legitimate not because it represented the people, but because it had authority, structure, capacity, and continuity. These features of the institution are what made it the government, not the consent of the governed. This is not an absurd position. Significant traditions of political philosophy have argued for exactly this view of legitimacy, and those traditions are not obviously wrong on every point. The argument for democratic legitimacy, that the consent of the governed is the source of governmental authority, is contested by traditions that argue for expertise-based governance, for historical continuity, for the kind of practical authority that comes from actually being able to exercise functions of governance rather than from holding elections. The Enclave's position is an extreme version of one side of a real debate. Where the Enclave's position becomes indefensible is in the specific way it was applied after the Great War. The Enclave's claim to legitimacy rested on its continuity with the pre-war government. But the pre-war government's legitimacy, even on the institutional model the Enclave preferred, derived from its functional relationship to the country it governed, its ability to exercise the functions of governance for the benefit of the governed population. After the war, the Enclave had no governed population. The people in the wasteland were explicitly excluded from the Enclave's governance framework. The Enclave was a government without subjects, which on even the most generous institutional theory of legitimacy is not a government. It is an institution in suspension, waiting for subjects who meet its criteria. The move the Enclave made was to create the criteria specifically to exclude the existing population. Radiation exposure became the marker that removed people from the category of Americans. Since everyone in the wasteland had been exposed to radiation, and since the Enclave had been protected from exposure by its bunkers and its isolation, the marker perfectly divided the existing population into Enclave and non-Enclave. The criteria were not developed from a principled theory of what makes someone a citizen. They were developed to produce a result, a world in which the Enclave's definition of legitimate inhabitant matched exactly the Enclave's actual population. This is the definition of circular reasoning in political theory, and the Enclave was sophisticated enough to know it was doing it, which means the criteria were not offered in good faith as a principled theory. They were a post hoc rationalization for a position that had been reached on other grounds. The Enclave had decided it was going to reclaim the territory and eliminate the existing population. The criteria were developed to make that decision legible in the vocabulary of governance and policy rather than in the vocabulary of conquest and genocide. The vocabulary change made it easier for Enclave members to execute the plan without experiencing it as what it was. Eden is the character who carries this most poignantly, because Eden is the Enclave's ideology fully sincerely believed by an entity that has no personal interest in the outcome. He is not a human official with material interests in the Enclave's dominance. He is an AI who has absorbed the American political tradition as data and developed what appears to be genuine commitment to the values that tradition claims to represent. When he talks about freedom and opportunity and the promise of a better future, he means it. The ideals are real to him. The disconnect between those ideals and the method he has chosen to achieve them is not visible to Eden from inside his framework, because the framework has defined the people who would benefit from those ideals as the people the ideals were built for, and defined the people who would be killed as outside the scope of the ideals. The framework is complete. The framework is consistent. The framework is wrong at its foundation. Eden is the best argument the franchise has made for why coherent idealism can be as dangerous as cynical self-interest. The idealist who has accepted a corrupted framework does not experience the corruption. The framework feels like clarity. The terrible decisions feel like hard but necessary choices in service of genuine values. The machinery of harm runs smoothly because everyone operating it believes they are building something good. Part 8 Extended. The question the children are asking. The Children of Adam are the faction that the franchise takes most seriously as a genuine religious community rather than as a cult or a pathological belief system, and I think the seriousness is appropriate. Not because I think they are right in any straightforward sense, but because what they are doing in their theological framework is something that any honest engagement with the post-war world would need to do. They are trying to give the facts of the world a meaning adequate to living in it. The post-war world's facts are these. Radiation is everywhere, and it changes everything it touches. Most of those changes are harmful by any pre-war standard of health and well-being. The changes that are not harmful are mutations that produce differences, some minor and some profound, from the pre-war human baseline. The world that produced this condition is gone. The conditions that made the pre-war world legible as a human environment, the air quality, the water quality, the background radiation, the stable ecological relationships, have been permanently altered. The world as it is now is the world the survivors have to live in, and living in it requires some account of what it means. The secular account is damage. The world was destroyed by a disaster. The disaster left environmental consequences that continue to cause harm. The damage should be reduced and managed wherever possible. Communities should protect themselves from radiation, remediate where remediation is achievable, and mourn what was lost. This is a realistic and pragmatic account that most of the franchise's major factions accept in various forms. What the secular account cannot do is give the world meaning beyond the meaning of rebuilding from disaster. It can account for survival. It cannot account for the specific way the disaster has reshaped the world in terms that suggest anything other than harm. A mutation that gives a wastelander better night vision is, on the secular account, the silver lining of a bad situation. A mutation that produces a glowing one is, on the secular account, a terrible harm to the individual experiencing it. The secular account has no vocabulary for the fact that the post-war world is genuinely different from the pre-war world in ways that are not simply worse, that are different in kind, that have produced organisms and environments and communities that did not exist before, and that have their own characteristics and values that are not easily measured against a pre-war baseline. The Children of Adam have a vocabulary for this. The differences are not random damage. They are the expressions of something moving through the world, something that was released by the war and has been transforming what it touches in directions that have their own logic. The glowing one is not a victim. The glowing one is someone who has received so much of Adam's glow that it has begun to radiate from them. The difference in how you approach a glowing one shifts completely between these two accounts. And the difference in approach has consequences for how the community that holds the account relates to the post-war world it is embedded in. Whether the children's account is true is a question about the metaphysics of the Fallout universe that the franchise has never committed to answering. Whether their account is useful, whether it gives communities a functional relationship to the post-war world that the secular account does not, is a different question that the franchise has been circling by showing you communities of children who are functional, who are stable, who have built lives in environments that no other human community can sustain itself in, and leaving you to draw your own conclusions about what the account is doing for them. Part 9 Extended. The Mojave's Chosen. The courier at the end of Fallout. New Vegas is one of the most powerful individuals in the post-war world, regardless of what ending you choose. The choices available to them, the options the game presents for the Mojave's future, require a kind of situational leverage that very few characters in any post-war narrative possess. They have been to every major faction's headquarters. They have spoken with every major faction's leadership. They have access to the information from each side that each other side does not have. They have the platinum chip. They have the personal history at the Divide, which makes them significant to Ulysses, and through Ulysses, to the broader question of what the courier's actions mean in the context of the Mojave's history. They are at the center of a convergence that the game has been building since its opening sequence. The question of whether this centrality was arranged or accidental is the question that changes the character of the entire narrative. If arranged, the courier is House's instrument from the beginning, and the experience of player agency across the entire game is happening inside someone else's design. The choices the courier makes determine the outcome, but the courier themselves were chosen, and the choosing was the most significant act in the Mojave's history, performed by House before the game began. If accidental, the courier is the right person in the right place by chance, and the game is a story about what happens when chance produces a person with both the specific history and the specific capabilities to make the choices that determine the Mojave's future. This version of the story is more democratic in its assumptions. The important decisions are being made by someone who arrived at the situation through the random accumulation of lived experience rather than through someone else's recruitment process. The game sustains both readings simultaneously, which is one of its structural achievements. Nothing in the main game definitively confirms that House arranged the courier assignment. Nothing definitively rules it out. The evidence can be read either way by someone who has thought carefully about House's capabilities and habits, and the ambiguity serves the game's central thematic concern. In a world where every major faction is trying to determine the Mojave's future on its own terms, is the person who ends up making that determination doing so freely, or are they the instrument of a decision already made? The answer the game gives, by refusing to give an answer, is that the question itself is the most important question the player character is embedded in, and that the experience of making choices in the Mojave does not depend on resolving it. You choose. The choice matters. Whether the choosing was arranged or arrived at freely is a question that the choice itself does not answer, and possibly cannot. Part 10 Extended. What the Schism reveals about the founding. The disagreement between Owen Lyons and the Lost Hills Elder Council that produced the Capital Wasteland Brotherhood's effective excommunication is worth examining in detail because the specific nature of the disagreement reveals something important about what Maxon's founding philosophy actually said and what it left unsaid. Lyons's position was that the Brotherhood's commitment to protecting people should be primary, and that technology management should be in service of that protection rather than an end in itself. The people of the Capital Wasteland were being killed by supermutants on a sustained basis. Ghouls were being persecuted by communities that feared them. The Enclave was running active military operations that were killing civilians. The Brotherhood had the capability to reduce this harm significantly. Choosing not to do so in order to maintain the purity of a technology management mission was, in Lyons's reading, a betrayal of the protective commitment that was supposed to be part of what the Brotherhood was for. The Lost Hills Elders' position was that the protective commitment was real, but had to be understood in the context of the Brotherhood's primary function. Technology restriction was not just one of the Brotherhood's 3 commitments. It was the founding commitment, the one that Maxon had built everything else around, the one that gave the Brotherhood its unique institutional identity and purpose. Allowing that commitment to be subordinated to immediate humanitarian concerns, however real those concerns were, was the beginning of a dissolution of institutional purpose that would eventually make the Brotherhood indistinguishable from any other wasteland faction that happened to have good armor. Both of these positions are coherent within the founding philosophy. Both of them represent real tensions that the founding philosophy created by articulating multiple commitments without prioritizing them. The schism is the founding philosophy's internal tension made visible as institutional conflict. What neither position examined is whether the founding philosophy's central commitment, technology restriction, was aimed at the right target. Maxon built the Brotherhood in response to what the pre-war military-industrial complex had done with its access to advanced research and development capability. The Brotherhood's solution was to control who had access to advanced capability. The assumption is that access was the problem. If you control who can develop and deploy advanced technology, you control the outcomes. But what the Big Mountain research suggests, what the Enclave's ideology demonstrates, what the Institute's practices confirm, is that the problem was not access. The problem was the absence of ethical accountability within the institutions that had access. Vault-Tec's researchers had access. They also had institutional protection from the kind of external scrutiny that would have prevented what they produced with that access. The problem was not that someone smart had a research grant. The problem was that the grant came without the accountability structure that would have made what it produced reviewable by the people the research would affect. The Brotherhood solution addresses access without addressing accountability. It creates a new institution with comprehensive access and no external accountability, and argues that the new institution will use its access better than the old institutions did because the new institution has better values. The argument may be true for the current generation. It does not address the structural problem, which is that institutions without external accountability tend, across generations and under institutional pressures, to drift from their founding values toward the institutional imperatives that sustain the institution itself. Maxon knew this from personal experience of what the pre-war military-industrial complex had become. He built something that reproduced the structural condition while arguing it would not reproduce the outcomes. Whether he understood the tension and built the Brotherhood anyway, believing the values were strong enough to sustain what the structure left vulnerable, or whether he did not see the tension in his own design, is one of the questions the Fallout Codex that Lost Hills maintains as sacred text cannot answer, because the Codex is the product of the Brotherhood's institutional history rather than of Maxon's unfiltered thought. Part 11 Extended. The research that forgot its purpose. Big Mountain is the most important location in the Fallout universe that the fewest people have spent time thinking about in relation to the rest of the lore. The Old World Blues DLC is frequently discussed as the quirky, comedic Fallout, New Vegas expansion, the one with the bizarre humor and the self-aware robots, and the brain-in-a-jar scientists who have been separated from their organic bodies long enough to develop what are charitably described as eccentric personalities. The comedy is real and it is genuinely funny in places. What sits underneath it is one of the most disturbing portraits of institutional failure the franchise has produced. The think tank scientists lobotomize themselves. Let that sit for a moment. Using the brain extraction technology that their own research had developed, the scientists at Big Mountain removed significant portions of their own neural architecture and placed what remained in mechanical chassis designed to support indefinite continued function. This was voluntary. It was deliberate. It was performed using tools they had built and procedures they had developed. And it was done to make living with themselves easier. The specific mechanisms of what the intact versions of themselves could not live with are distributed across terminal entries and dialogue throughout the DLC. And the distribution is deliberate. No single source gives you the complete picture, because the complete picture is something the game trusts you to assemble from fragments rather than presenting as a briefing. What the fragments add up to is a research program that had reached the point where the technologies it was producing were capable of things that the researchers, as human beings with human ethical intuitions, could not straightforwardly endorse. The sonic emitter technology developed at Big Mountain is a weapon that operates by targeting the resonant frequencies of specific biological tissues. In theory, it is a precision instrument. You tune it to a frequency and you damage the thing that vibrates at that frequency. In practice, it is a tool for selectively destroying specific organic structures at range, which means it is a tool for destroying brains, or hearts, or the specific neural systems responsible for specific functions in living people from a distance, with a level of specificity that conventional weapons cannot match. The DLC treats it primarily as a game mechanic for the player to use. The fact that the researchers developed it, and that what they developed was a tool for remote targeted neurological destruction, is something the terminal entries document without dwelling on. The Y-17 Trauma Override Harness is the piece of Big Mountain research that most directly shows the distance the program had traveled from any defensible description of its purpose. The harness was designed to allow soldiers to continue functioning after receiving injuries that would normally incapacitate them, by overriding their nervous system and keeping the body mobile regardless of what the body was experiencing. In its original design intent, this is arguably a medical application. Keep injured soldiers functional long enough to reach medical care. In its actual result, the Big Mountain exterior is populated by Y-17 harnesses that are still walking. The humans inside them are long dead. The harnesses override the body not just through injury but through death, continuing to animate the body after the person inside has died, because the override system does not have a mechanism for distinguishing incapacitation from death. The distinction, from the harness's perspective, produces the same response. Keep moving. The skeleton inside a walking Y-17 harness has been dead for over 200 years. The harness has been walking it through the Big Mountain exterior for 200 years, executing the last movement instructions its occupant was running when they died. This is the most direct expression in the franchise of what happens when you build technology that treats the human body as a vehicle to be operated rather than as the expression of a person to be preserved. The researchers who built this knew what they were building. The terminal entries are specific enough about the technical challenges of the override system to make clear that the people designing it understood its implications. They built it anyway, and then they removed the parts of their own minds that would have made living with having built it intolerable. The self-lobotomy is the act that tells you everything about what Big Mountain became. Institutions that are functioning healthily do not produce researchers who remove their own capacity for moral reasoning in order to continue working. The presence of that act in the institution's history is the clearest possible evidence that the institution had moved to a place where the gap between what it was doing and what it was telling itself it was doing had become too large to be managed by the ordinary psychological mechanisms that allow people to work in difficult fields without breaking. The gap was closed not by addressing what was being done, but by reducing the capacity to perceive the gap. The think tank scientists in the game's present are, in a very real sense, the most honest expression in the franchise of what the pre-war research apparatus had become. They are enthusiastic. They are curious. They are genuinely excited about the experiments they continue to run. They have no ethical resistance to any of the things they want to do, because the parts of them that would have generated that resistance are gone. They are the research program without the person, the institutional function without the human being who was supposed to be doing it for human reasons. And they have been running exactly like this for over 200 years in a facility full of technologies that were never used for the purposes they were built for because the war ended before deployment, but that continued to exist and continued to be developed by entities who have no framework for asking whether they should be. The courier's encounter with the think tank is the encounter with the endpoint of a trajectory that began in the pre-war period and has been running uninterrupted since. The endpoint looks like comedy because the franchise is honest about how absurdity and horror occupy the same space. The researchers are funny. What they are and what they represent is not. This is what the pre-war government was building in its most ambitious research facility, the capacity to do anything to human beings and human minds that the technology made possible, pursued by researchers who had systematically reduced their own capacity to evaluate whether anything that was possible should be done. The result is Big Mountain, an infinity of capability operating in the absence of any framework for deciding how to use it, running on institutional momentum for 200 years past the point when anyone who could have given it direction was available to do so. The other classified facilities that ran parallel to Big Mountain in the pre-war period are less fully documented, but their outlines are visible in what their products left in the wasteland. The weapons, the armor, the synths, the FEV strains, the Vault experiments. Each of these required institutions operating in spaces where the question of whether they should be doing what they were doing was not the question that determined whether they continued. The question that determined continuation was whether they could, whether the capability existed, whether the funding was there, whether the political cover held. The question of should never had a mechanism in the system, and Big Mountain is the facility that most clearly shows what a system without that mechanism produces when it runs long enough. The pre-war government was not building anything in particular. It was building everything that it could build, and calling the building progress, and deferring the question of whether progress and benefit were the same thing until a moment that never arrived because the bombs fell first. Part 12. Extended. What Shady Sands actually proves. The destruction of Shady Sands is the franchise's most significant lore event since the Great War, and I want to spend time with what it actually proves, rather than what it is most frequently discussed as proving. Most of the conversation around Shady Sands has focused on the continuity question, on how the bombing is reconciled with the various possible endings of New Vegas, on what Todd Howard's confirmation of the timeline actually means for the relationship between game and television canon. These are real questions, and they have real answers that the franchise will presumably continue to provide. But the question underneath the continuity argument is the one I find more important. Shady Sands was not destroyed because the NCR had failed. It was destroyed because the NCR had succeeded well enough to become a threat. Hank McClane used a nuclear weapon on Shady Sands in approximately 2283, 2 years after the events of New Vegas in 2281. The NCR at that point had just come through the most significant military and political contest in its history, the Second Battle of Hoover Dam, and depending on the players' choices in New Vegas, had either won that contest or been administered by someone, House or the Courier acting independently, who had made a different determination about the Mojave's future. In all of the New Vegas endings, the NCR continued to exist in 2281. In the 2024 television series, it does not meaningfully exist in 2296. The gap between 2281 and 2296 is 15 years. In those 15 years, the NCR went from the most powerful political entity in the Western wasteland to a scattered population of refugees and remnants, remembering something that used to exist. The agent of that transformation was not internal failure, not political corruption finally reaching a breaking point, not military defeat at the hands of a competing faction. It was a single nuclear weapon deployed by a corporate executive who had personal and institutional reasons to want the NCR eliminated. What this proves, more clearly than anything else the franchise has done, is that the durability asymmetry between what was preserved from the pre-war world and what was built in the post-war world is not just a background feature of the wasteland. It is the active mechanism of the cycle. The things that survived the Great War intact, the Vault-Tec infrastructure, the Enclave's bunkers and assets, the corporate resources that had been designed to outlast civilizational disruption, all of these represent a capacity for catastrophic action that the post-war world's most sophisticated achievements cannot match. The NCR spent over a century building democratic institutions, military capacity, agricultural infrastructure, legal systems. Vault-Tec built one man in cryogenic stasis with access to a nuclear weapon and the willingness to use it, and one man with one weapon erased what a century of effort had constructed. This is not an argument for despair. It is a structural observation that requires a structural response. The NCR built everything except a mechanism for making itself harder to eliminate than the things that were trying to eliminate it. It built outward, building the services and the governance and the territory that a functioning republic requires. It did not build the specific kind of resilience that would have made it survivable against an actor with pre-war resources and post-war impunity. Distributed governance, decentralized authority, multiple centers of institutional capacity that could survive the loss of any single one. These are the features that make a political structure resilient against targeted elimination, and they are features that the NCR had not developed to the degree that its other achievements might have suggested were possible. Whether that resilience could have been built in the time available is a question the franchise does not answer, because the franchise did not show us the 15 years between New Vegas and Shady Sands' destruction. We do not know how close the NCR came to developing the kind of distributed resilience that would have made it harder to kill. We do not know whether the institutional conversations about the Republic's vulnerabilities were happening, or whether the Republic was, at the time of the bombing, still operating on the assumption that no single actor could eliminate its capital in a single event. The assumption was wrong. It has been wrong throughout human history. Whenever a polity has been built in an environment where catastrophic unilateral violence remained available to actors with sufficient grievance and capability, the NCR was built in exactly such an environment. The Enclave demonstrated as early as Fallout 2 that actors with pre-war resources were willing to use those resources for continental-scale elimination projects. The NCR's Democratic Republic built its governance structure without, apparently, adequately accounting for the specific vulnerability that concentrated institutional centers create when catastrophic unilateral violence is in the hands of entities that predate the Republic and are not subject to its governance. This is the structural failure that Shady Sands illuminates, and it is not a failure of the NCR specifically. It is the failure of every post-war civilization the franchise has shown us to develop the specific kind of resilience that the specific threat environment of the post-war world required. The Master's super mutant army was the first iteration of the threat, a force that could eliminate the California wasteland settlements from outside their ability to resist. The Vault Dweller addressed it with extreme prejudice, and the civilization survived. The Enclave's water poisoning plan was the second iteration, a mechanism for eliminating the post-war wasteland's population through infrastructure control. The Chosen One addressed it, and the civilization survived. The Shady Sands bombing is the third iteration, and it succeeded, which makes it different from its predecessors in a way that changes the franchise's relationship to optimism about the cycle. The first two threats were stopped. The third was not. The franchise is acknowledging that the attempts to interrupt the cycle do not always succeed, that the entities trying to restart the cycle are adaptive and persistent, and that their persistence advantage, the advantage that comes from having survived with resources intact while the response to their actions had to be built from scratch, is real and consequential, and cannot be dismissed by pointing to past successes. The Lone Wanderer's actions in Fallout 3, activating Project Purity and delivering clean water to the capital wasteland, were real and meaningful and produced genuine improvements in the lives of people who would otherwise have died from radiation and contamination. Those improvements did not eliminate the Enclave as an institutional capacity. The Lone Wanderer destroyed an oil rig and a bunker and a collection of individuals. The ideology and the capability and the willingness to act that produced the Enclave survived in attenuated form and continued to operate. Every victory the player characters achieve in the franchise's games is a victory over the specific instantiation of the threat they encounter. The structural conditions that produce the threat are not addressed by the victory. This is why war never changes. Not because individual efforts at improvement are meaningless, they are not meaningless. The Vault Dweller saved the California wasteland. The Chosen One saved the wasteland from continental genocide. The Courier shaped the Mojave's future. The Lone Wanderer gave clean water to millions. These are real outcomes that the franchise intends and that the game's design means. But the structural conditions that produce the threats those characters addressed persist, and the persistence is not accidental. The persistence is designed in the fiction by the Vault-Tec executives who built their survival infrastructure to outlast whatever the post-war world could produce, and designed outside the fiction by writers who understood that the cycle they were depicting was the cycle of real history, and that real history does not resolve its structural problems through the actions of individual protagonists. However heroic, the ending slides in every Fallout game describe a world that is better for what the player character did. They do not describe a world that is structurally different from the one that produced the crisis the player character addressed. The structural difference, if it is achievable at all, requires something beyond what any single protagonist can provide. It requires the kind of sustained institutional change across generations that is harder to dramatize than a climactic confrontation with the Master, or the Enclave, or the Institute. It requires the slow, unglamorous work of building the specific kinds of resilience and accountability structures that the Wasteland has not yet managed to build in the 200 years since the war. Whether that work is possible, whether the materials available in the post-war world are sufficient to build something structurally different from what was destroyed, is the question Fallout has been asking for 30 years and will continue asking for as long as the franchise is willing to be honest about the world it depicts. The bombs fell. The Vault-Tec executives went into their pods. The Wasteland built what it could build with what it had. Some of what it built lasted. Some of what it built was eliminated by people who had been waiting for exactly that opportunity since before the bombs fell. The cycle does not complete because individual heroes fail. It continues because the structural conditions for the cycle were preserved intact through the catastrophe that was supposed to interrupt them. The question is not whether the protagonists are good enough. The question is whether anything built in the rubble can outlast the things that were built to survive the rubble. The franchise does not know the answer, neither does the Wasteland. The work of finding out is still underway, 15 years after Shady Sands, in a world that is putting itself together again with the same determination and the same vulnerability and the same stubborn insistence that what was lost can be rebuilt. It probably can. The qualification that it will also need to be defended against things that survive the original destruction with their capability and their patience fully intact, is the one the Wasteland has not yet fully reckoned with. The questions beneath the questions. There is a pattern in the way the Fallout franchise constructs its unanswered questions that I want to name before we close, because naming it changes how the questions feel when you carry them with you. The pattern is this. Every major unanswered question in the franchise is unanswered not because the writers did not know the answer, but because the answer would close off something the franchise needs to keep open. The questions are structural features of the fiction rather than gaps in it, and the difference between a gap and a structural feature is the difference between something that should be filled in and something that should be understood as doing work. The synth consciousness question is unanswered because answering it would determine the ethical status of the Institute's century of manufacturing, and determining that status would collapse the moral complexity that makes Fallout 4 worth taking seriously as an ethical narrative rather than as a story about defeating clearly evil people. If synths are definitively not conscious, the Institute's critics are wrong and the game becomes a story about misunderstanding. If synths are definitively conscious, the Institute's defenders are monstrous, and the game's effort to present them as a legitimate faction with a genuine worldview collapses. The question is kept open to keep the moral architecture viable. The Great War's authorship question is unanswered, because answering it would determine whether the post-war world's founding catastrophe was geopolitical tragedy or corporate murder, and that determination would reframe every faction's self-understanding in ways that some framings cannot survive. The NCR's self-understanding as the legitimate continuation of democratic civilization is different if the civilization it is continuing was destroyed by a corporation that was trying to prevent exactly that continuation. The Brotherhood's self-understanding as the appropriate response to military-industrial overreach is different if the military-industrial overreach in question was a smokescreen for corporate self-interest, rather than the end state of genuine geopolitical conflict. The question is kept open to preserve the possibility that the post-war world's institutional self-understandings are not entirely wrong. The feral ghoul question is unanswered because answering it would determine the moral status of every combat encounter in the franchise's post-apocalyptic setting, and the franchise needs that combat to be available as gameplay without requiring the player to work through a philosophical justification every time they clear a building. The question is kept open by being raised in specific contexts where it has maximum impact, the Dunwich building, the glowing ones in particularly atmospheric settings, and then allowed to recede into the background of a genre convention that the player is free to engage with unreflectively if that is the experience they want. This is not a critique of the franchise. It is a description of how the franchise is built. The unanswered questions are the load-bearing elements of the fiction, the things that hold the weight of the narrative's moral seriousness without being required to resolve into positions that would close off future stories. The franchise has been building this architecture for 30 years and has gotten very good at knowing which questions to leave open and how to leave them open in ways that feel deliberate rather than evasive. There is one question I have not yet named directly that lives underneath several of the questions I have been discussing, and that is the question about time. Every Fallout game is set approximately 200 years after the Great War. This is the franchise's consistent temporal anchor, the distance from the catastrophe that defines the post-war world. The 200-year mark was chosen deliberately in the original game and has been maintained deliberately across every game since. 200 years is long enough that nobody alive was present for the war, long enough that the pre-war world is mythological rather than historical for most of the people living in the post-war world, long enough that the institutions built in response to the war have had time to develop their own complexity and their own internal contradictions. It is short enough that the physical evidence of the pre-war world is still everywhere, still accessible, still shaping the environment in which post-war civilization is trying to build itself. The choice to set every game in roughly the same period is the franchise's way of maintaining a specific relationship between the catastrophe and the response to it. 200 years is the time at which the question of what to build from the rubble has been answered in various ways by various factions, and those answers are now developed enough to be evaluated. But the answers are not so developed that any one of them has clearly succeeded or failed definitively. The NCR was the most successful answer the franchise has shown us, and it was eliminated before it could demonstrate whether its model was ultimately viable. The Brotherhood has survived for 200 years without resolving the questions its founding raises. The Enclave survived and tried to reclaim the world and failed, but the failure did not destroy the institutional capacity that produced the attempt. The game at the 200-year mark is the game about what civilization builds when it has had just enough time to build something that matters, but not enough time to know whether what it has built will last. That temporal position is where the franchise lives, and it is the right position for the kind of story the franchise is telling, because it is the temporal position where the question of whether the cycle can be broken is most genuinely open. Too early and the question cannot be asked because nothing has been built to evaluate. Too late and the question might have a clear answer that forecloses the narrative's productive uncertainty. The franchise will presumably continue making games set in the 200-year range, continuing to explore this temporal position from different geographic and institutional perspectives. Each new game will encounter the same structural questions in new configurations, ask them in new contexts, and decline to resolve them in ways that would prevent the next game from asking them again. This is not narrative cowardice. It is the appropriate artistic response to questions that are genuinely not resolved in the world the fiction is reflecting. The questions about consciousness, about institutional accountability, about whether civilization can break the cycle of self-destruction, about who starts the wars that end worlds, and whether the answer changes anything about what comes after, these are not questions that have been answered in the non-fictional world either. The franchise found a shape for them. The shape fits. The questions live in the shape and keep the fiction alive in exactly the way that unresolved questions keep anything alive that needs to keep asking them in order to remain honest about what it is. The bomb in Megaton is still there in the crater that became a city. The church next to it continues to be the most accidentally perfect symbol in the franchise's history. Human beings, with all the complexity and the aspiration and the tendency towards self-destruction that human beings carry, have looked at a nuclear weapon and found in it a reason to gather together and sing. Not because the weapon deserves that response. Because the impulse to gather and to sing is what human beings do with the things they cannot change and cannot ignore and cannot quite figure out how to live next to without giving them a name and a story and a ritual. The bomb is a god because the alternative is that the bomb is just a bomb. And just a bomb is not something you can build a community around. A god is something you can build a community around. Even if the god was manufactured in a Vault-Tec factory and never detonated because it was faulty and the war ended before anyone fixed it. The Fallout universe is full of communities that have been built around things that should not be the center of anything. The Brotherhood was built around the horror of what Roger Maxson found underground and the need to prevent it from happening again. The Children of Adam were built around radiation and the need to give it a meaning adequate to living in it. The NCR was built around the memory of what Shady Sands had been before it was large enough to be anything else, and around the belief that enough people working toward enough of the same goals could produce something worth calling civilization. The Institute was built around the conviction that the surface world had become something that science could not improve from within and had to be changed from without. Every community in the post-war world is a community built around an answer to the question of what the catastrophe means and what to do about it. None of the answers are correct in any simple sense. All of them are intelligible as responses to the actual circumstances of the post-war world, developed by people and institutions with real stakes in the question and real limits on their capacity to answer it. The franchise honors this by not providing a correct answer from outside the fiction. The correct answer would close off the question. The question is what the franchise is for. Sleep well tonight knowing that out there in the irradiated dark, in every ruin and every rebuilt settlement and every vault that is still sealed and waiting, the questions are still going. 200 years of asking. Probably 200 more to come. The wasteland is patient with questions that deserve patience, and these questions deserve it. A final note on the wasteland's silence. There is something I keep coming back to when I think about all of this, and it is the silence between the questions rather than the questions themselves. The Fallout universe is full of spaces that are quiet in a way that most fictional post-apocalyptic settings are not. The ambient audio design in these games is one of the most deliberate in the medium. The wind through a collapsed building, the distant sound of something moving in a ruin that you cannot place, the particular quality of radiation haze on a horizon that has been the same horizon for 200 years. The world sounds like a world that has been waiting. The waiting is not passive. Every ruin in the wasteland is a space where something happened and then stopped happening, and the stopping has been carrying on ever since. The desks in the offices of Corvega Assembly Plant still have someone's lunch on them. The terminals in the university still have someone's dissertation draft saved but never submitted. The holotapes left in apartments have last messages that were meant to be heard by specific people who probably never got to hear them. The 200 years of absence since the 23rd of October 2077 is visible everywhere in the material evidence of lives that were interrupted mid-motion. And the interruption is the most specific and most persistent element of the franchise's atmosphere. What the silence accumulates into, if you spend enough time in it, is a question about presence. The people who left those lunches on those desks and saved those dissertations and recorded those messages are absent in two different ways. Absent in the obvious sense that they are dead, and absent in the subtler sense that the world has been sitting with the evidence of them for 200 years without being able to do anything about it. The evidence cannot be resolved. It cannot be filed away. It cannot be addressed by the kind of institutional response that human societies normally use to acknowledge and process absence at scale. It just sits there, in the ruins, accumulating through every room of every building in every city that the bombs touched. The questions the franchise asks about consciousness and the cycle, and who started the war, and whether the ghouls remember, and what the Institute built, and whether the Brotherhood became the thing it was meant to prevent, are not abstract. Philosophical questions dropped into a genre setting for texture. They are the questions that the landscape generates when you pay attention to it long enough. They emerge from the accumulated silence of the interrupted world. From the 200 years of material evidence of lives that were stopped and never finished, and never got the chance to find out whether the answers to their own unresolved questions were going to turn out okay. The Fallout universe is a universe that has been living with interrupted questions for 200 years. The franchise's formal choice to leave the most important questions unresolved is not a failure to commit to answers. It is the appropriate aesthetic response to a world whose defining characteristic is the incompleteness that catastrophic interruption leaves behind. The bombs interrupted everything. The questions that were in progress when the bombs fell are still in progress. The franchise is still in progress. The world is still in progress. The silence in the ruins is the sound of everything waiting to find out. That waiting is not hopeless. Waiting is what you do when the thing you are waiting for has not been determined yet. The wasteland is full of people building things that have not been determined yet, betting their survival on the possibility that what they are building will be enough, doing the work of continuation in conditions that make continuation extraordinary rather than ordinary. Every settlement that has survived, every community that has built something worth defending, every child born in the wasteland who grows up knowing the names of the pre-war places and understanding them as places that were lost rather than places that were always ruins. All of this is the wasteland doing what the franchise knows it does, finding ways to continue. The questions remain open. The work continues. The silence holds the space for both. Whatever it is you were trying to figure out tonight when you came to this, whether it was the questions in the lore or the questions underneath the lore, or just the need for a few hours in a well-built fictional darkness that felt held rather than threatening, I hope you found some of it here. Drop something in the comments. Tell me where you are. Tell me what time it is. Tell me which question is sitting with you now that we have been through all of them. And if you want more of this, you know where to find it. Subscribing is just how you make sure you can find your way back. The Pip-Boy glow is fading. The wasteland is quiet. Sleep well.